Today, if you can handle it, I'm going to be telling you hours of stories about wilderness adventures that went horribly wrong. And you better brace yourself because, at least to my knowledge, this first story has never been told on YouTube ever before. Every now and again, things happen in the backcountry that just straight up defy all logic. Trips that should have been ordinary and fun turn into stories that you can't forget. Stories that remind you just how thin the line between adventure and disaster truly is. So hit that subscribe button right now and help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers. And brace yourself because this first story is just unreal. Rangers at Great Sand Dunes National Park had seen plenty of strange things before. You know, abandoned tents, stranded cars, footprints that vanished into the sand. But what they found in May of 2017 just felt different. For several days, a single vehicle had sat motionless near a picnic area, dusted in red grit and half buried by the wind. There was no permit on the dash, no sign of life whatsoever. The Rangers assumed that whoever parked the car here would end up turning up by the evening, right? But evening came and went, and nobody showed up. And when park rangers ran the plates, a name came back that made them stop cold. They were very familiar with the name Brian Skolinski. He wasn't supposed to be missing again. You see, months earlier, Brian had already been rescued from this same exact national park after spending 5 nights lost in a snowstorm that nearly killed him. It was a miracle survival story, one that even made the local news, one that should have changed everything. So how did his car end up in Great Sand Dunes National Park again, unmoved for days in one of the harshest environments in all of Colorado? That question would haunt everyone who knew him, and the answer, when it finally came, would be far worse than anyone could have possibly imagined. Brian Skolinski was 40 years old, and he was from a little town called Phoenix, New York, not Arizona, to be clear. He was a Navy veteran, a quiet, thoughtful guy who sometimes would just kind of disappear for stretches of time to clear his head. We've all kind of been there. His mother, Maxine, said that Brian wasn't reckless, he was just independent, right? And so earlier that February, Brian decided to rent a car and he pretty much just drove west. He told his family that he'd be gone for roughly a week. And somewhere around the Rocky Mountains, the road widened into desert and Brian saw the sand dunes for the very first time. Those endless gold waves pressed up against the white peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. And as soon as he laid his eyes on them, Brian knew that he needed to hike them alone. On February 11th, Brian parked his car in a horse trailer lot near Medano Road. The weather on this particular day, well, I'll just say that it wasn't very friendly. Deep snow covered the trails, wind blew around like a freight train, and temperatures were already dropping towards the teens. Brian wasn't planning to camp overnight, and so he carried no sleeping bag, no tent, and he had barely enough food for just a single day. But once he started walking down the trail, he couldn't stop. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was even something deeper, I don't know. But later, Brian would admit that he told himself over and over, quote, 3 feet of snow won't stop me. 4 feet of snow won't stop me. That voice, you know, the one that convinces you to keep pushing when logic says to turn around, well, that voice would soon become his worst enemy. By nightfall, the snow was waist deep. Brian dug a hollow near a tree and he crawled inside to try and escape the wind. And at this point, the only food he had with him was a breakfast bar, a few Oreos, and pretty much nothing else. Day 1 turned into day 2, and then day 2 turned into day 3. By this point, he was licking the empty cookie bag just to taste something, anything. And back at the horse trailer lot near Medano Road, rangers noticed a single car parked overnight. They checked it for an overnight permit, but of course they found nothing. Brian, again, wasn't supposed to be out there overnight. It was just supposed to be a day hike. And so he was declared missing, and search and rescue teams were quickly called in. Nearly 30 people on foot, horseback, and even in helicopters scanned 40,000 acres of dunes and forest. For 5 nights, Brian wandered in circles, frostbitten and dehydrated, even hallucinating. He thought he saw like wolves off in the distance. And just to be clear, there were no wolves. Brian was in dire straits at this point. But somehow, he kept moving. And on the 6th day, a ranger spotted a single figure staggering through the snow off in the distance. And of course, this was Brian. When they found him, Brian could barely stand. His boots were split open where he'd hacked them apart after they froze solid overnight. His hands were raw from exposure. He was extremely banged up, to say the very least, but he was alive. Against all odds, I might add. Alive. Brian refused medical treatment, and then he checked himself into a cheap motel, trying to thaw out and make sense of what the hell had just happened. His story quickly hit the local media, with reporters calling him, quote, the man who beat the dunes. His mother cried when she heard Brian's voice on the phone. Brian would later say that he was embarrassed. I didn't want to go to the extremes that I did, he told a Denver news crew. I just wanted to exert myself. This sounded like closure, a happy ending with a big lesson learned in the process. But anyone who's spent time in the wilderness knows that surviving once can almost make you feel invincible. And that's where the danger really starts, by the way. Eventually, spring rolled around in Great Sand Dunes National Park. Snow melted and all the tourists returned, taking pictures of those long ridges glowing gold against the mountains. And while all of this was happening, somewhere way up in New York, nearly 2,000 miles away, Brian must have been thinking about those mountains as well. And I say that because on May 8th, he drove back. Brian returned to Great Sand Dunes National Park, and he even pulled into the same exact road where he'd nearly frozen to death just a few months earlier. He didn't tell his mother where he was going. He didn't get a backcountry permit. He didn't leave an itinerary with rangers or anyone for that matter. Maybe Brian wanted to conquer the place that had almost killed him. Maybe he finally wanted some closure and some peace. Or maybe he was being extremely stubborn. Whatever the reason, Brian locked his car, he shouldered his backpack, and he vanished into the sand dunes for the second time. When rangers found his car days later, they launched another search. And at first it felt like deja vu, right? The same person is missing in the same park. They're getting the same eerie silence. They don't know what's happening. But this time, conditions were worse, if you can believe it. Snowstorms swept down from the peaks, erasing any trace of footprints within just a few minutes. Winds must have reached like 40 miles an hour, with sand slicing sideways through the air in pretty much every direction. Helicopters did their best to circle low and try to spot something. Dog teams worked the drainages in the area, and searchers on foot combed 14 square miles of wilderness. But after 7 days, they had to stop. It was just too dangerous to keep looking. They were giving the mountain everything that they had, but the mountain wasn't giving them anything back. Weeks would pass, and then months, and Great Sand Dunes National Park stayed quiet, except for all that wind. But then, 7 weeks after Brian was last seen, a group of hikers were climbing towards Milwaukee Peak, high above the sand dunes. The trail was still half buried in patches of snow at this point, and near the edge of a ravine, one of these hikers noticed something that seemed out of place. This was a dark shape kind of contrasted against the pale ground. The hikers radioed this finding in, though they couldn't get close enough to actually tell what it was. And that was probably for the best. The very next day, recovery teams from multiple counties hiked in to confirm what pretty much everyone feared. This strange sighting that the hikers had had the day before was in fact the body of Brian Skolinski. He'd been found in an area that had been pretty much impossible to reach during the initial search. You know, there was just too much snow. It was too steep, too icy, but eventually most of that snow and ice did melt out. And when it did, it finally revealed what winter had hidden. Brian's body was found miles away from where he'd parked his car, and the coroner's report would later say what pretty much everyone already knew, that the very same landscape that had nearly killed Brian once had essentially finished what it started. There were no signs of foul play. It was clear that Brian had died out there in the elements. And I keep coming back to something that Brian said in that interview after his first rescue. He told the reporter that he'd gone to the park to, quote, find motivation for the next 40 years of his life. And I gotta say, that line hits me pretty hard, because maybe this whole trip wasn't actually about adventure, like most people's trips to national parks are. Maybe Brian's trip was about some sort of deeper meaning. And it's easy to judge all of this from the outside, to say that Brian should have turned around or packed better or told someone where he was going, or not even gone back to the national park in the first place, or I guess the second place, actually. But Brian wasn't reckless for the thrill. He was actually searching for proof that he could still endure, that he could still feel alive. Remember, he survived that very first time. And when you survive something like that, it can almost start to feel like a calling. But maybe I'm overthinking this. I probably am, actually. Brian's mother would later say that she hadn't slept the first time that he disappeared. And it's hard to say, but she couldn't have known that she would live through that nightmare again, this time with even worse results. I mean, that's the hardest part of this story for me, man. And the second hardest part for me is that if Brian had been carrying one of these, he almost certainly would have survived, a lot easier the first time and survived in general the second time. This is a satellite messenger with an SOS button on it. It's going to work in remote areas without cell coverage. And I plead with all of you to never go into the backcountry without one of these. Now, this isn't sponsored or anything. I just think it's super important to have. And Brian's story is just another example of someone who would have made it if they did have one. I do have some affiliate links to a variety of these types of devices in the description, but you can also find them for cheaper if you buy a slightly used one or even a refurbished one. And so I don't care how you get one, just please don't go hiking without one of these. When you stand in Great Sand Dunes National Park, you can see miles of golden ridges fading into the distance and quite often snow on all of the peaks above. It looks beautiful, like something that couldn't possibly hurt you, right? But those same winds that shape those dunes can bury everything in its path. And so if you ever go there, please remember Brian Skolinski, a man who came looking for purpose and found both peace and yet peril at the same time. You absolutely can and probably should point out the mistakes that Brian made in the comments below, but please just do so respectfully. Remember, you're talking about a man that had a family and loved ones, and so, be honest. We want to help people here, but yeah, just please show him respect in the process. May he rest in peace, and let's get on to the next story. In the winter of 2012, a young man vanished in the frozen wilderness of Vermont. It all started as just a simple hike, but somewhere along the way, things went terribly wrong. At first, it just seemed like your typical missing hiker case, right? But I promise you that this story is unlike anything you've ever heard before. And I say that because what they found in those woods wasn't just heartbreaking. It was so shocking that it literally forced an entire state to change its laws immediately. This story has never been told on YouTube before, at least as far as I'm aware. And by the time that you hear the end of it, you're not just gonna be shocked, you're gonna be straight up pissed off. Now, if you couldn't tell from my shirt right here, well, I'm from Vermont. I don't live there anymore, but I did back in June of 2020. And it was right around then that I went for a hike on the Coulee Glen Emily Proctor Loop, which lies within Green Mountain National Forest. This hike is about 13 miles, and while I was on it, I had no idea that roughly 8 years prior, that very same trail that I was on was the setting of one of the most frustrating cases in all of National Forest history. So with that said, let's take a virtual trip right now to my home state, Vermont. In January of 2012, 19-year-old Levi Duclos decided to go for a last-minute solo hike on the Emily Proctor Trail in Green Mountain National Forest. Well, I say that, but I guess technically it was a solo hike, but maybe technically it wasn't. And I say that because Levi did bring the family dog, which was named Duke, along with him. So I don't know. He was the only person anyways. So just like yours truly, Levi grew up right at the front door of Green Mountain National Forest. But after graduating high school, he decided to explore some different scenery. He actually went and spent a few months in Nepal over the summer, and then he headed to Portland, Oregon to start his freshman year of college at Reed College. After his first semester at Reed, Levi went back to Vermont for winter break, excited about his new experiences and his new friendships that he made at school. I'm sure those of you that went to college can understand this. You do this semester, then you come back and you're just full of opportunities and possibilities. And so this winter break offered him a chance to kind of just pause after all that stuff and just reconnect with his roots and his hometown. And in an effort to do this, Levi decided to go for a hike. At 12:30 p.m. on January 9th, 2012, he leashed up Duke and he began to lead him up the Emily Proctor Trail. And again, speaking as someone who has hiked this very same trail before, it's not an easy hike per se, but it's definitely not extreme either. In fact, for Vermont standards, this is my opinion, I would say that it's pretty tame. And for Levi, this hike really shouldn't have been much of a problem. You see, it's really important for you to know that Levi was an athlete. He was fit. He had a pretty good amount of hiking experience. Maybe not on this particular trail, but on plenty of similar trails in the area around his hometown. The temperatures were a little bit unseasonably warm, you could say, on January 9th, 2012. And before Levi set out, he told his younger brother a vague overview of what his plans were going to be. And so those two factors combined with Levi's level of fitness should have made his hike a safe, if uneventful, ordeal. And that's why when Levi's mother, Anne, returned home from work around 6 p.m., she was shocked to find that Levi hadn't returned home from his hike. Anne immediately had this gut feeling that something was wrong, and unfortunately, that gut feeling was deadly accurate. So on January 9th, 2012, Levi's mother, Anne, arrived home from work right around 6 p.m., and she was very alarmed that Levi clearly had not returned from his hike. And so she quickly began kind of analyzing his stated plans in her head, desperately searching for any excuse as to why Levi was still out there, why he wasn't home yet. Levi had stated that he was going to be hiking the Emily Proctor Trail. However, he didn't really make clear what his actual destination was. There's no mountain peak at the end of the Emily Proctor Trail. It basically just connects with the long trail. There's a shelter there as well. And so Anne wasn't really sure if Levi had just kind of hiked up the Emily Proctor Trail and then turned around, or if he was planning on completing the much more ambitious Coulee Glen Emily Proctor Loop hike. In addition to that confusion, Anne also wasn't sure what gear, clothing, or food and water that Levi had taken with him. She had no idea if Levi was equipped to spend a cold winter night outside, and frankly, Anne didn't really plan on waiting around to find this out. And so Anne called her sister-in-law, who is named Kathy, and the two of them came to a very sobering conclusion. By this point, it's now 8 p.m. Levi is still nowhere to be found, and though it had been warm earlier in the day, the temperature outside was now dropping very, very fast. It's important to note that even if it's warm down in town, down in the valley, up in the mountain, the temperatures can still be deadly cold. In a last-ditch effort of hope, Anne enlisted the help of a friend who actually lived very close to the Emily Proctor trailhead. This friend drove the short distance over to where the trail starts to see if Levi's car was still parked there. Because if it wasn't, then maybe he was okay and he was just on his way home or something like that. When Anne learned that Levi's car was in fact still parked at that trailhead, she now knew without a shadow of a doubt that her son was still up on that mountain somewhere. This was the final straw for Anne, and it's what pushed her to do the thing that every parent dreads the most. She picked up her phone, she dialed 911, and she reported her son missing. Now, the state of Vermont handles search and rescue missions a lot differently than most states. So instead of these missions being taken up by like state game wardens or local fire departments or volunteer search and rescue organizations, these missions are instead spearheaded by the Vermont State Police. And so, recognizing the urgency of an overdue hiker potentially stranded in freezing conditions, as soon as the state police got the call, they immediately dispatched to the Emily Proctor trailhead. They also immediately informed the local fire department in the town of Ripton, and they called out for any assistance that they could get from other local volunteer search and rescue groups. And thanks to these efforts, within an hour and a half of Anne's initial 911 call, there were 2 search teams ready at the trailhead. One search team was going to hike up the Emily Proctor Trail, which was Levi's known direction of travel, and the other team was going to hike up the Coulee Glen Trail in case Levi had actually decided to complete that 13-mile loop. Because the state police understood the urgency of the situation and because they immediately formulated an effective plan, they gave Levi, who was likely stranded or injured but still alive, the highest probability of survival. The only problem, however, was that everything I just told you about the state police's response was complete fiction. I made it up. Now, I'm sorry for lying to you folks, but the reason that I just made up all of that stuff about the police's response is because that basically would have been the best case scenario, and I want you to contrast it with what actually happened after Levi Duclos was reported missing. And once again, just be warned, I think by the end of this video, you're probably going to be pretty pissed off because the way that the Vermont State Police handled the search for Levi was incompetent at best and extremely negligent at worst. So let's go into the actual story of what happened. So Anne calls 911, and right after she did this, she formed a makeshift search party of her own, which consisted of her sister-in-law Kathy and 3 others, people that were both friends and family. By the time that they all arrived at the Emily Proctor trailhead, it was just before 10 p.m. You know, this is about an hour and a half after Anne had called 911, and yet when they arrived, there were no searchers or no police officers, literally 0 people on scene at the trailhead yet. But that was about to change. So right as the group of 4 was about to actually begin their search, a lone state trooper pulled into the dark, cold parking lot. Anne and Kathy hoped that this meant the official search, you know, the ones by the professionals, not just the family thrown together. They hoped that this meant the official search was about to be launched, or at the very least that this officer would maybe join them in their last-minute search. After all, time was of the essence here. It was cold, Levi could easily freeze to death, and the quicker that boots were on the ground searching for him, the higher the chances of his survival. However, despite all of that, and much to Anne and Kathy's surprise, the only thing that this state trooper did was give them a warning. Well, actually, he gave them 2 warnings. First, he informed them that another officer would be coming by shortly to kind of inspect the scene, whatever that means. And secondly, he warned them not to search for Levi. He said it was safer and wiser to leave that to the experts, which is reasonable. It's understandable at the very least. But after giving these warnings, the state trooper drove away. He left, leaving Anne, Kathy, and the rest of the group completely perplexed at what to do. I mean, they were told not to search themselves, but they weren't given any information about when the official search would actually be started. Anne's son was somewhere potentially dying on the mountain at that very moment. And they had 4 people at the trailhead ready to search, and yet they were told to just wait? Like, wait for what? It obviously didn't make any sense. And so the group ignored the officer's directions. Kathy stayed at the trailhead in case Levi emerged or other officers and searchers arrived, and the rest of the group decided to go up the Coulee Glen Trail. Again, hoping that if Levi had decided to do that loop, they would be hiking the loop in the opposite direction, and they would have a higher chance of kind of intercepting him along the way. The group hiked a few miles into the dark Vermont wilderness, but eventually they came to the crushing realization that they had chosen the wrong trail. By the time that they reached the intersection with the long trail, there were 0 footprints in the snow, meaning that it would have been impossible for Levi to have been there. And the thing you have to understand is that when they were deciding on which trail to search, they basically had to make a 50-50 decision. And tragically, and through no fault of their own, of course, they simply chose the wrong trail. At 12:30 a.m., now on January 10th, another state trooper arrived at the Emily Proctor trailhead and began to speak with Kathy. 4 critical hours had now passed since Anne's initial 911 call, and I'm sure that Kathy felt some relief when this officer arrived, some relief that help had finally gotten there. But, of course, this hope was quickly crushed when Kathy realized that this trooper's main focus was not to go actually find Levi, but rather to get her to fill out a missing persons form and kind of just start with that. So while this was happening, Anne and the rest of her group returned to the parking lot, and they reported that Levi had not been located on the Coulee Glen Trail, which therefore meant he must be stranded somewhere on the Emily Proctor Trail. That's what all logic and reason pointed to, and you would think that when confronted with this information, the state troopers would have immediately began hiking up the Emily Proctor Trail. Or at the very least, they would have called in the local Ripton Fire Department, who always had search and rescue volunteers on standby. You think that they would get somebody up that mountain immediately, but they didn't. It quickly became clear to Anne that the state troopers had 0 intention of doing any of those things. And so with this realization, Anne decided that she had no choice but to take matters into her own hands. And so she resolved to hike up the Emily Proctor Trail herself. And in one of the most astonishing twists in this story so far, the state troopers told Anne that if she tried to continue searching for her own son, they were going to be placing her in handcuffs and taking her to jail. At this point, it was almost 1 a.m. Levi hadn't been seen since he started his hike at 12:30 p.m. the previous day, and an official search still had not yet been authorized. The troopers were kind of at the trailhead just messing around, doing bureaucratic stuff, filling out forms, stuff like that. There was no official search declared, but that did soon change. The police finally declared an official search, and they then immediately informed Kathy and Anne that the state police do not conduct searches at night. This meant that the search wouldn't start until the following morning, with the troopers beginning their shift at 6 in the morning. And so, completely defeated and facing arrest, Anne, Kathy, and the rest of their group were basically left with no choice but to just return home. As the temperature continued to drop, Levi was still up on the mountain somewhere. And, by the way, just to add insult to injury, one of the state troopers had filled out a search urgency form and marked that there was no hazardous weather predicted, which is insane. It's the winter, it's night, you're in the mountains, it's freezing cold. And tragically, and obviously, the very next morning, everyone would learn that that search urgency form was the understatement of the century. It's still unclear to me why the Vermont State Police refused to search for Levi in the darkness. I guess that they would probably cite safety as the reason, and assuming that's true, you would think that they would have, at the very least, started the search as soon as it was light enough to see without a headlamp, right? Like, why would you waste any time? But of course, that's not what happened here. In fact, the 3 state troopers and the 1 search dog that would be tasked with going to find Levi didn't even arrive at the Emily Proctor trailhead until 8 in the morning. By this point, it had been almost 12 hours since Anne's 911 call, and the official search was only now just getting started. This group of state troopers did eventually start climbing up the Emily Proctor Trail, and for the first few miles, things seemed pretty normal. They slowly made their way up the icy and snow-covered path until a very horrifying sight stopped them in their tracks. It was now 12 p.m., almost 24 hours since Levi had first started his hike. And so their discovery started with the dogs. So again, these troopers had a canine with them, and their dog kind of noticed something up ahead. He was kind of alerting, but at first the officers couldn't really tell what was going on. But then the Duclos' family dog, Duke, came wandering down the trail, and at this point the troopers knew that they were closing in on something. And so they continued hiking for just a short distance further when all of a sudden this group of Vermont state troopers came upon the deceased body of Levi Duclos. He was located less than 3 miles from where his vehicle was parked down in the trailhead, less than 3 miles from the very same trailhead that Anne and the rest of her group had been at the night before. And chillingly, on Levi's head was a headlamp that was still lit up from his struggle to survive his hike back down from the night before. And so after confirming that Levi was no longer alive, the troopers kind of secured the scene and they built a fire. They did their best to rescue Duke, trying to keep him close to the fire, trying to keep him warm. And then they turned their priorities from a rescue mission into an investigation. It wasn't immediately clear how or why Levi died. And so one of the state troopers continued up the trail, kind of following Levi's tracks to try and get some more answers. Levi's tracks continued all the way to the Emily Proctor shelter, at which point they turned and followed the long trail north. This indicates that Levi may have been attempting to hike that Coulee Glen Emily Proctor loop after all, but at some point he had decided to turn around. Levi's backpack was found along the long trail, but that didn't really yield any additional evidence. Though the tracks did continue on, the state trooper eventually decided to kind of call it and to turn around so that he could make it back down before daylight ended. Once again, it's brutally cold on the spine of the Green Mountains. And I can only imagine that as all of those troopers fought off the cold during their investigation and the body recovery, the importance of a swift search surely must have set in. I mean, I really wonder if they realized in those moments that they had blown it. But then again, I don't know exactly what they were thinking, but I do know, however, what the public was thinking when they learned the story of Levi Duclos. And folks, it really was not pretty. There was some initial confusion about Levi's cause of death, because at first the state police reported that he had broken his leg and then he'd tried to drag himself down the trail before eventually dying. But at some point the police actually redacted this statement and said that Levi had not actually broken his leg. And so the exact details that led up to his death are still a bit unclear to this day. But the cause of death is the exception to that. The cause of death was crystal clear, and it was hypothermia. Hypothermia is a dangerous condition that occurs when the body loses heat faster than it can produce it, which leads to confusion, shivering, a slowed heart rate, and of course death if not treated quickly. Levi was probably rushing back to his car, kind of trying to make it back before darkness set in, and he ended up injuring himself to the point where he couldn't walk anymore. We don't know what the injury was, but he probably tried to slide down the trail as far as he could, and eventually he just couldn't go any further, and hypothermia set in. Now, I've obviously placed a lot of blame on the police in this story, and I'm going to be coming back to them in just a second here. But right now, I do want to make one very important thing clear, which is that Levi made some very poor choices in his clothing and his gear on this hike, to the point where it very well likely cost him his life. And I don't say that to blame him or to shame him. We all make mistakes. But Levi was found wearing cotton clothing, which is a very big no-no when it comes to winter hiking. I'm sure some of you know this, but in case you don't, cotton absorbs moisture, it dries really slowly, and it doesn't insulate when it gets wet, which increases the risk of hypothermia for any hiker who is wearing it. And in addition to that, Levi was very clearly not planning on being in the woods for very long because he had no backup clothing to change into. He didn't have like an emergency blanket or any other gear that could have kept him warmer for longer. And again, I'm in no way trying to disparage Levi. I myself have made all of those same clothing mistakes on winter hikes before. I literally summited Vermont's highest mountain in the winter while I was wearing cotton clothing back in high school. I was just lucky, and I lived to tell the tale. I just think it's important to mention Levi's clothing and his gear choices because it is a massive takeaway, a lesson, if you will, from this case, and I hope that by mentioning it, at least one of you will be safer next time that you're on trail. He definitely made some bad choices with his gear and his clothing, and those certainly played a very, very big role in this story. But I have to say that despite those choices, there's still a very, very high chance that Levi would have survived if the Vermont State Police had acted even halfway competently after receiving Ann's 911 call. And thanks to media coverage of this case, including many pieces by a writer named Cindy Hill, the Vermont public and Vermont lawmakers were pissed about what happened. Levi's uncle was quoted saying, "I must reiterate that the Vermont State Police definitely blew it in the case of my nephew Levi." Now, I am far from an expert on hypothermia, but my understanding is that it takes some time to set in, right? It's not like an immediate thing that happens. There's no way for us to know exactly what time Levi died, but it is very likely that if a search had been conducted on the night of January 9th, shortly after Levi had been reported missing, he would have been found probably injured and very cold, but alive. There were multiple local and volunteer rescue teams that the Vermont State Police could have called in to help launch a quick search. In fact, the Emily Proctor Trail is located in the town of Ripton, Vermont, and the Ripton Fire Department has training in search and rescue. I mean, they live there. They're intimately familiar with all of the trails that are in their forests, and their fire captain would even go on the record saying that if they had been contacted that night, they would have put boots on the ground to search for Levi immediately. And what's even more frustrating to me is that this would not have been a complicated search. Levi was reported missing very quickly. His car was found at the trailhead. Everyone knew which trail he had taken. It's not like there was a massive search area and Levi could have been lost anywhere and it would have taken, days or weeks to find him. All it would have taken was like 2 or 3 volunteers to hike less than 3 miles up the Emily Proctor Trail by headlamp, and Levi most likely would have been found alive. But the Vermont State Police never notified any local search and rescue groups about Levi's disappearance. And in an incredibly frustrating twist of events, when a few of those local volunteer groups were eventually notified, it was the next day, and it was only so that they could come help remove Levi's body from the woods. Levi's death opened up a massive statewide discussion about search and rescue. Once again, Vermont handles their search and rescue way different than most other states. Many people, including Kathy Duclos, called on the Vermont State Legislature to strip the Vermont State Police of its power to handle search and rescue altogether. There were a lot of investigations which revealed that many local search and rescue groups that were trained and eager to help rescue lost hikers in Vermont had been rebuffed by the state police or just simply never utilized. I even found that at least one of these groups would just end up calling it quits and disbanding altogether. After over a year of press coverage, study committees, and debate between Vermont lawmakers, Governor Peter Shumlin signed a law that completely overhauled search and rescue procedures in the state. Though Vermont State Police did ultimately remain in charge of search and rescue. This legislation mandated quick response times and coordination with local search and rescue groups, which, again, were the two biggest shortcomings in Levi Duclos' case. I want to make it clear that I'm not telling you this story just so I can rip on the police or whatever. You know, there's plenty of that in today's society, and I'm not trying to add to that noise. But I do think that you can be the most back the blue kind of person out there and still acknowledge that the way the Vermont State Police handled Levi's case was a complete and utter disaster. Now, this story took place over 13 years ago, and as far as I can tell, confidence in Vermont's search and rescue practices has been largely restored. Vermont State Police were very open to hearing criticism about their failures, and they were very cooperative in changing their practices. And so you got to give them credit for that, but unfortunately, as good as that is, it can't bring back Levi Duclos. Levi's mother, Anne, would express regret about calling 911 on the evening of January 9th, 2012, because if she had called the local fire department instead, it's very possible that Levi would still be alive today. May he rest in peace, and my heart goes out to him, as well as Anne, Kathy, and the rest of the Duclos friends and family. I encourage all of you to leave some love for all of them in the comments section. I love it when you guys are super kind to the people I talk about in these stories. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone. Barbara Bolick was just mere feet away from her hiking partner when, in just a matter of seconds, she vanished without a trace. And I don't mean that she fell out of sight or she was grabbed by someone. She truly just vanished right in front of her hiking partner. No screams, no footprints, nothing at all. That sounds impossible, right? Well, maybe it is. That's the story. Or maybe it's not impossible. I'm going to be telling you the real story of Barbara's disappearance, all of the prevailing theories, and I'm going to be telling you how this story that's been declared impossible by so many experts may not be so impossible after all. And so you're going to want to stick around, because by the end of this video, you're going to hear an easily overlooked detail that changes everything. On a summer day in 2007, Barbara Bolick went on a hike with her new friend, Jim, in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains. It was a friendship that would be very short-lived. So a few months ago, before I'd even heard of this story before, I took a very short trip to Missoula, Montana, which is just north of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a beautiful, clear day while our plane was descending into town, and I distinctly remember just kind of looking out over the Bitterroots and noticing just how vast and how empty those mountains looked. Now, because I make all of these videos, I can't help but notice when certain mountain ranges just kind of give me a strange feeling inside. My gut was just, I don't know. It sounds dramatic and weird, but of course, I didn't really know why at the time, but I now know that my gut feeling was for a reason, because just a few months later, here I am telling you a story about these mountains. But even putting that gut feeling aside, while my plane was landing, I also noticed just how beautiful those mountains looked. And that is something that Barbara Bolick would have agreed with wholeheartedly. I have no problem saying that because it's true. In fact, in 2001, Barbara and her husband, Carl, moved to the town of Corvallis, Montana, which is right at the base of the Bitterroots. And it didn't take long after that for Barbara to fall completely in love with those mountains. The couple had spent most of their marriage in the New York City metro area, where Carl had been stationed in the Air Force and then later worked for JP Morgan Chase. I mean, can you imagine the contrast of their lives in Montana versus their lives in New York City? I mean, going from the hustle and bustle, the skyrise buildings and the crowds, going from all that stuff to slow living, mountain cabins, and almost zero other people around you. I mean, that's incredible. Talk about two opposite worlds, right? Now, the move was initially a little bit rough for Barbara, but she quickly began to thrive in her new home. She started doing things like, taking pilot lessons. She started to ski, which is something I enjoy a lot. But actually, speaking of things I enjoy a lot, the hobby that filled Barbara with the most joy was, of course, hiking. And so with that said, I want you to take a very close look at this trail right here, because this trail, it's called Bear Creek Overlook. Well, this trail happened to be Barbara's favorite hike in the entire world. And it just so happens that the spot that you're looking at right now is the last place that Barbara was ever seen. In July of 2007, the Bolicks had some visitors to their home in Montana. Now, these visitors were Carl's cousin, Donna, and Donna's boyfriend, Jim, who I'm not 100%, but I'm fairly certain had never met the Bolicks before. At least he hadn't met Barbara. Now, since the Bolicks lived in such a beautiful area, Barbara was always keen to give their visitors a glimpse into the wild Montana backcountry. I mean, who could blame her? I would do the same thing if I lived there. And so this, coupled with the fact that Barbara's husband, Carl, was no longer able to hike due to some medical issues, well, the fact that she didn't have any hiking partners ever, and the fact that she wanted to show off the beautiful area, those factors drove Barbara to invite Donna and Jim on a very short hike to the Bear Creek Overlook. And at first, Donna and Jim seemed pretty into the idea. They made plans to do the hike the very next day, and then they promptly began tossing back a few drinks, if you know what I mean. And it appears that at least one of them had at least one too many. It's possible that, I'm totally speculating here, but it is possible that if the group hadn't kind of hit the booze that night, well, I wouldn't be making this video right now, but we'll get there. So the next morning rolls around. It's now the morning of July 18th, and Donna informs Jim and Barbara that she was far too hungover to go trampling through the Montana wilderness. And, fair enough. I get it, but this did kind of put Jim and Barbara in a bit of an awkward situation. Have you ever been introduced to a new person by a friend of yours, and then, your mutual friend, the one that knows both of you, just leaves the room, and now it's just you and this person you just met, and it's just kind of awkward, Well, I'm kind of imagining this situation with Jim and Barbara being like that when Donna decided that she didn't want to go hiking. But to be honest with you, I'm probably overthinking it, because Jim and Barbara decided to go on the hike anyways. They decided to go despite Donna backing out. And thus, around 9 in the morning, Barbara said goodbye to her sleeping husband, and she told him that herself and Jim were heading to go hike Bear Creek Overlook. Now, I imagine that some of you might feel uncomfortable, even a bit scared by the prospect of a loved one going off hiking in the Montana wilderness. I mean, there's bears out there, there's all sorts of scary stuff, right? I say that, but it's actually safe to say that this was not the case with Barbara's husband, Carl. Barbara had spent years by this point hiking around in the area. In fact, she had literally done the Bear Creek Overlook Trail countless times before. It was her favorite hike. She knew the trail so well that she basically could have done it blindfolded. And in the event that something did go wrong, Barbara always carried protection. No, not that kind of protection. Get your mind out of the gutter. I'm talking about a firearm. Because this area of Montana is home to grizzly bears and mountain lions, Barbara always carried a .357 Magnum pistol when she was hiking. And so that, combined with her experience on the Bear Creek Trail, combined with the fact that she also had a hiking partner in Jim, well, all of those factors meant that the chances for something going wrong here should have been extremely low to non-existent at all. When Barbara and Jim started the 15-minute drive to the trailhead, Carl, who was still in bed, well, he wasn't worried in the slightest. But the same thing couldn't be said for Donna. Maybe it was just the hangover anxiety. I don't know what it was, but by 12 o'clock noon, Well, Donna was starting to get very worried that Jim and Barbara hadn't returned yet. However, you have to keep in mind that Donna was very unfamiliar with the hiking in this area. She wasn't from there, she was just visiting, right? And Carl knew that they had been gone for a pretty normal amount of time to do this hike, and that they would likely be returning home any minute. But then, another hour passed without any sign of Jim and Barbara coming home. And it's at this point that Carl, too, began to worry. He insisted on waiting until 2 o'clock. And if the pair of hikers hadn't returned home by then, Carl would pick up the phone and he would report them missing. But, as fate would have it, Carl would never get the chance to make that call. As he was kind of debating about what to do in his head, all of a sudden Carl heard his phone ring. And he was greeted by a voice that he had never heard before. The person on the other end identified herself as a law enforcement officer for the United States Forest Service, and then she asked Carl if his wife's name was Barbara. When Carl heard that question, he braced himself. Now, I really hope that none of you have ever had to experience this, but can you just imagine a police officer calling you and then asking to confirm your spouse's name? I mean, that can only mean that some very bad news is imminent, and unfortunately, that's exactly what happened to Carl. This officer informed Carl that Jim had reported his wife missing. And this came as a total shock to Carl because, once again, he was very confident that Barbara would keep herself safe while she was hiking. I mean, if anything, Carl felt that Jim should have been the hiker who became lost. I mean, he was in an unfamiliar part of the country. He had never hiked Bear Creek Overlook before. In fact, I'm not even sure if he had any hiking experience at all. The whole situation was very, very strange. And so at this point, Carl jumped into his car and he drove straight to the trailhead. And once he began to hear Jim's story, Carl's life would be changed forever. Carl and the police listened intently as Jim described a story that was basically impossible. According to Jim, himself and Barbara had made it to the actual Bear Creek Overlook, which I showed you a minute ago and you're now looking at it again. They stopped here to have a snack and they chatted with two young men who had hiked to the overlook with their dog. At some point, these two men began hiking back to the trailhead, leaving Jim and Barbara behind to enjoy the overlook. And then, sometime between 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., Jim and Barbara decided to also begin making their way back. Barbara led the way as they departed from the overlook, but Jim decided that he needed to take one final look at the beautiful view. And so while Barbara was 20 to 30 feet in front of him, Jim kind of turned around again, and he spent no more than 45 seconds taking in the view for the last time. And when he looked forward again, when he looked back down the trail, Barbara was gone. Jim hiked a little bit further down the trail, figuring that Barbara might have just kind of pulled ahead of him out of sight. But as he continued to hike further and further, he still saw no sign of her. He began meticulously searching the trail, kind of looking for any sign of what might have happened. But he found no discarded gear. He found no marks on the trail that would indicate a struggle or a fall. He found nothing out of the ordinary whatsoever. He hadn't heard anything after he turned around to look at the view. He didn't hear any screams. He didn't hear any loud or concerning sounds at all, which is very strange because the area near the overlook has a lot of loose shale. You're going to know what I'm talking about if you've ever experienced this. If you've ever tried to walk on this stuff, it's very loud and kind of clanky when you move around on it, which makes it all the weirder that Jim didn't hear anything. And so he kept hiking back towards the car. And by the time that he reached the trailhead, an unbelievable reality had kind of set in, for real. That reality, of course, was that Barbara Bolick had just vanished into thin air. Now, the Forest Service road that Jim and Barbara had parked on was under construction at the time. And so when Jim emerged from the woods, there were actually a few construction workers nearby. Jim began talking with these construction workers, and of course, he asked them the obvious question, had they seen Barbara? And the answer to that was no, they hadn't seen her, but they had seen those two young men with their dog. Since these two men were the only other possible witnesses besides Jim, the police immediately began working to track them down. And this would end up being much more challenging than it sounds. Pretty soon after, a massive search for Barbara was launched. And usually when a hiker goes missing, even if like the hiker themselves aren't located, there's usually like some sort of evidence that's found. You know, maybe a piece of their gear or some prints in the dirt, or at the very least their scent is tracked by dogs, which gives some initial clues into, you know, what direction they traveled. What makes Barbara's disappearance so baffling, and I do not use that word lightly, is that despite a professional and very thorough search, none of the things I just mentioned were found. Literally nothing. No tracks, no scent, no discarded gear, nothing. Literally nothing. Which meant that the only thing the police had to go off was Jim's version of events and the version of events from those young men, if they could ever find them. So how could someone just vanish right in front of their hiking partner? I mean, there has to be some sort of explanation, right? And the answer to that question is, well, there's actually a few explanations. And so you better listen closely, because it's actually going to be up to you to decide which one of these makes the most sense. Weeks, months, and eventually years went by, and to this day, no sign of Barbara has ever been found. And to make this case even stranger, no sign of those two men that were on the trail that day has ever been found either. They never came forward. Their identities remain unknown, and that's all despite a fairly large media campaign to try and find them. That's all despite a composite sketch, and it's despite a $10,000 reward for identifying them. Somehow they just never found these men, and that actually brings us into our first, and definitely not our last, theory about what happened to Barbara Bullock. Now, I need to stress here that pretty much everything that you're going to hear for the rest of this video is going to be speculation. I'll make it clear when I'm telling you a cold hard fact, but a lot of this is just going to be kind of exploring the possibilities of what might have happened. So the first theory is that those two unidentified young men had something to do with Barbara's disappearance. And I will admit that it is a bit suspicious that they were the only other hikers on the trail at the time, and that they never came forward and identified themselves. Like, what did they have to hide? The nearby town of Missoula does have a university there, University of Montana, I believe. And so it's possible that maybe these two young guys were like college aged and they went to school there, but I don't really know. It certainly seems weird that the only two other witnesses disappeared, but at the same time, it is very possible that these two men just simply never found out about Barbara's disappearance. I mean, they could still be out there to this day, you know, just blissfully unaware of the baffling mystery that they unknowingly took part in. I mean, hell, they could even be watching this video right now. So if that's you, hey, you might want to call somebody. Nah, but in all seriousness, it's very likely that these two men just never found out about the case. I mean, maybe they were visiting at the time and, you know, they got back from their hike in the Montana mountains and then they flew back to Cleveland or wherever they're from, and the news just never spread to them. And in addition to that, there's actually another thing that kind of contradicts this theory, and it actually contradicts the next theory as well. And so let me tell you about that first. Another common theory that explains Barbara's disappearance, and I guarantee a few of you have already been thinking this, maybe you've even commented it by this point. This theory is that Barbara could have been attacked by an animal, maybe a mountain lion or a bear or something like that. And while this certainly is possible, I tend to think it's pretty unlikely, because once again, there were no signs of a struggle found anywhere on the trail. Like, there was no drag marks or blood or even any marks in the dirt at all. And once again, Jim heard no noise. He heard no screaming. Barbara was so close in proximity to Jim when she disappeared. Like, I don't know. I feel like if she was attacked by an animal, or even by a person for that matter, going back to the previous theory, I just feel like there would have been any sign of it, right? The searchers didn't find anything. And don't forget, once again, she was carrying that .357 Magnum, which she certainly would have used if she needed to defend herself. It's for all of those reasons that I think an animal or a human attack on the trail is pretty unlikely. If you have any evidence to the contrary, I'd love to hear it in the comments section, genuinely. And so that brings us to our next set of theories, which is that Barbara either took her own life or that she intentionally disappeared, ran off, and then started a new life somewhere. Now, the new life theory seems pretty much impossible to me. I don't know how she would have pulled that off. And as far as I'm aware, she didn't have a motive to do this, or a motive to take her own life for that matter. Her marriage was stable. She liked her life in Montana. She even loved it, you could say. In addition to all that, she was also looking forward to some future travel plans that she had discussed with her friends and her family. And so, based on all that, I think those two scenarios are pretty unlikely. Now, one of the most perplexing aspects of this case is that search dogs were brought in just a few hours after Barbara disappeared, to try to track her, to lock onto her scent and give some indication of where she went. And yet, despite being brought in so quickly, the dogs never identified her scent. And let me clarify what I mean by that. I don't mean that the dogs just couldn't track her scent, or that they followed her scent for a while and then eventually they lost it. I mean that the dogs literally never picked up a scent anywhere, including at that overlook that Barbara had taken a lunch break at. I mean, how is that possible? She was on the mountain just hours earlier, and yet her scent is nowhere to be found. It almost seems like it's not possible, right? And so this, folks, is where the biggest twist in this entire case comes in. This is the twist that's going to make you question pretty much everything I've told you about this story so far. There's only one logical theory that explains why Barbara vanished into thin air, one theory that explains why her scent was never found on the trail, and why there was no sounds or signs of a struggle. What if Barbara was never actually on the mountain that day at all? What if she never hiked the Bear Creek Trail on July 18th, 2007? I could be wrong, but in my opinion, this is the only possible explanation for her disappearance. And that, of course, begs a few questions like, where is she then? And who took her? Now, the obvious person to point the finger at here is Jim, of course. I mean, he was the last person to be seen with Barbara. And so is it possible that he killed her and then staged the hike so that police would be thrown off? Or is it even possible that Carl and Donna were involved as well, and they all colluded in order to kill Barbara, and that explains why she was never actually on the mountain? Those are very reasonable theories, and they've been discussed by people online quite a bit. I'm sure they'll be discussed in the comments of this video. Respectfully, please. Maybe those theories are possible. But to be honest with you, that stuff also seems hard to believe, in my opinion. The police obviously investigated Jim, Carl, and Donna, and you might be shocked to hear that all of them were cleared of involvement. None of them have ever been charged, and to be honest with you, it doesn't even really seem like they were ever considered suspects. Jim even volunteered to take a polygraph test, though the police didn't take him up on this for some reason. I find that a little strange. There's been no motives uncovered by any of the three of them, for why they would want to kill Barbara. There's never been any hard evidence found that points the finger at them, and all of them fully cooperated with the police. Folks, this is a mystery in the truest sense. And to be honest, out of all of the stories I've told on this channel, out of all the hikers that have gone missing that I've talked about, this one is by far the biggest head scratcher. To me, it seems impossible that Barbara actually made it onto the mountain that day. I mean, Jim's story just seems impossible and can't be true. And yet, it also seems impossible that Jim could have killed Barbara and then covered it up so easily in an unfamiliar environment, leaving the police with zero evidence to this day. That doesn't really make sense either. I genuinely hope I'm wrong about this, but I think that this is one of those cases that will probably go unsolved forever, which is tragic. My heart goes out to Barbara Bullock. And guys, please leave some love for her in the comments section below. I just really appreciate it when you guys do that. Shortly after this photo was taken, these climbers found themselves caught in a death trap. And ironically, it had nothing to do with the deadly height that they were hanging from. You see, as these climbers rested in their portaledge, suspended over 1,000 feet off of the ground, by the way, bullets began to pierce the rock wall all around them. They were completely helpless, and little did they know that this would mark the start of a nightmare so shocking that there's actually some people out there that refuse to believe it's true to this day. But folks, the thing is, this story is true. Every single imaginable threat that could possibly kill a human being was about to be unleashed on these climbers. I'm talking war, starvation, freezing temperatures, I mean, you name it. And as their situation got worse and worse and worse, the climbers were forced to confront the most important decision of their lives. They either had to accept death, or they had to pay the price to survive. I feel like I say this a lot, but this is honestly probably the most unique story that I've ever covered on my channel. And frankly, it's just very morbidly fascinating. I mean, let's be honest, that's why a lot of us are here in the first place. But I do just want you to remember that these are real people that experienced real horror and trauma, especially when you find out what they did at the end of the story. And so please just show these people the utmost amount of compassion and respect. And with that said, let's take a virtual trip right now together to the country of Kyrgyzstan. Now, this trip is totally free, but you have to hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you are a repeat viewer. There's literally thousands of you that watch all of my videos, or a lot of them, but aren't subscribed yet. So if that's you, please do it. Okay, so Kyrgyzstan is home to endless beautiful mountains and a lot of climbing routes. And of course, it's for that reason that in the year 2000, 4 young climbers, who were all very eager to prove themselves, began a months-long expedition in the southern region of the country. The climbers were 25-year-old John Dickey, 22-year-old Jason Smith, 20-year-old Beth Rodden, and her then boyfriend, 22-year-old Tommy Caldwell. Now, if the last 2 names I just said there sound familiar to you, it's probably because Beth and Tommy are both considered some of the best climbers ever, and they've been featured in tons of popular documentaries over the years, so there's a good chance that you've heard of them before. But it's important to know that all 4 of these climbers were rising stars in the community back in the early 2000s. In fact, this particular expedition to Kyrgyzstan was partially sponsored by the North Face, and these climbers hoped to spend a few weeks exploring this new and remote country, maybe climbing a few routes for the very first time in history before returning to the US with bigger climbing resumes, certainly, but also epic photos and just a lot of good stories. On August 11th, 2000, the group of 4 spent their very first night on what is known as the Yellow Wall. And it was actually Tommy's 22nd birthday. And so, suspended in their portaledges over 1,000 feet from the ground, Beth sang her boyfriend happy birthday before they all settled in for the night, excited to wake up the very next morning and continue exploring. But instead of doing this, they would end up waking up to literal gunfire. Like, you heard that right. On Tommy's very first morning as a 22-year-old, himself and the rest of his group were getting shot at. I mean, can you imagine this? You're hanging in this makeshift tent 1,000 feet in the air, and all of a sudden there's bullets pounding the wall behind you. You're a total sitting duck, right? And the group, they peered down to the ground below, and they saw 3 men kind of waving at them, 3 armed men, telling them to come down. Now, rappelling down to 3 men that were shooting at you was just about the last thing that the 4 climbers wanted to do, obviously. But I mean, what choice did they have? John actually volunteered to go down first, quite courageously volunteered, I might add, with his plan being to offer these men a pack of cigarettes. I mean, maybe that would kind of break the tension. Like, what else were they really supposed to do? The group hoped that John could quickly defuse the situation. I mean, they were literally getting shot at just 3 seconds earlier, but unfortunately, that was not going to happen. In fact, the group's nightmare was actually just getting started. They were now on a track that was taking them towards pretty much the most horrifying conclusion possible So John spends 25 painstaking minutes rappelling down to meet these armed men. And when he finally reaches them, he offers this pack of cigarettes. But unfortunately, the men were not interested. Instead, they communicate through hand gestures and broken English. They basically communicate that they would like to visit the climbers' base camp, which is located about a mile's hike away. John would nervously radio back up to his fellow climbers who are still up on the portaledge, telling them that they needed to come down. It still wasn't clear exactly what was going on, but at this point it was crystal clear to the group that they were essentially being kidnapped. As Tommy, Beth, and Jason began making their way down the wall, climbing down slowly, their heads were spinning with questions. I mean, probably many of the same questions that you're wondering about right now. Questions like, who were these men? Why were they taking the 4 Americans hostage? And probably most importantly, what was going to happen to the Americans next? And I don't have an answer for all those questions, but I do have an answer for the first one. It would turn out that the climbers had been taken captive by a group of Islamic rebels known as the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or IMU for short. And so as these rebels led the climbers on the hike back to their base camp, the climbers were actually able to learn a little bit more about them. So the first man's name was Abdul, and he appeared to be calling the shots, like he was the leader, if you will. And then the other 2 men were named Obert and Sue, respectively. Now, despite the fact that these men were armed and clearly kidnapping the young climbers, they weren't like behaving aggressively either. I mean, let me try to explain. Like they weren't yelling. They weren't like shoving their weapons in the group's faces. They weren't even laying their hands on them at all, for that matter. They had this bizarre calmness about them. And Sue in particular even seemed kind of friendly with the climbers. Their demeanor certainly added to the confusion of the situation, as did what the climbers saw when they returned to their base camp. When John, Jason, Beth, and Tommy arrived at what used to be their camp, they found it completely ransacked. And they also found a 4th man at their campsite, and this man actually looked kind of familiar. As it would turn out, this man was not a member of the IMU, but was rather another one of their hostages. His name was Turret. I think that's how you pronounce that. I apologize if I get his name wrong. And this gentleman was actually a member of the Kyrgyz army. The climbers had met him a few days earlier when they were kind of making their trek in. And while it was nice to see a familiar face, unfortunately, Turret had nothing but bad news to share. That's actually a bit of an understatement, to be honest. He basically told the young climbers that the rebels had killed a number of his fellow soldiers. I mean, their blood was literally still freshly displayed on his clothing. And he told them that the rebels were basically holding him hostage so that he could help guide them through the remote mountain terrain. That's pretty much the only reason he hadn't been killed as well. And so all of the hostages were then ordered to pack up what was left of their base camp, presumably to go on some sort of trek. And they had pretty much just about finished this task when all of a sudden, something happened that changed the rebels' demeanor from calm to vicious, pretty much in the blink of an eye. A helicopter, presumably from the Kyrgyz army, roared overhead. Abdul started to scream in broken English, and though his words weren't really clear, his message certainly was. And of course, the message was, take cover right now, and if you're responsible for the helicopter seeing us, then well, you're dead. There was good and bad news for John, Jason, Beth, and Tommy at this point. The good news was that the helicopter passed by without noticing them, and so nobody was guilty of blowing their cover. But the bad news was that this would not be the only time that a government helicopter would fly overhead. And to make matters worse, Turret informed the group that Kyrgyz army soldiers were actively hunting for the rebels in this valley, and basically that a firefight was imminent. I mean, it wasn't a matter of if bullets started flying, It was a matter of when, which is just insane if you think about it. I mean, it's somehow what had started out as this like once in a lifetime climbing trip for a bunch of young, blissful Americans had devolved into a war. I mean, just let that sit in for a second. The rebels and their captives left the base camp behind, carrying as much equipment and food as they could, and they presumably began marching north towards the border with Uzbekistan, at least according to Turret's hunch. They dodged more helicopters and government soldiers that were patrolling, and by the afternoon, there was just a lot of tension. Pretty much everybody realized that something was about to pop off. Beth and Tommy were mortified, thinking that their lives were about to come to an end. John and Jason were basically in survival mode, thinking about how they could potentially kill their captors and escape. And then there's Turret, who was in a whole world of his own, insisting that the rebels were going to kill him as soon as a firefight broke out, and he was basically just trying his best to come to peace with his inevitable fate. Around 3 p.m., the rebel fighters set off this hasty ambush on a group of Kyrgyz fighters coming up the valley, and almost immediately, the young American climbers watched in horror as multiple soldiers were killed instantly. The group of hostages quickly ducked behind a large rock, deeming it the safest possible place to wait out the action. But one of them wouldn't remain there for very long. As the gunfight intensified, Abdul suddenly confronted the group and asked Turret to come with him. He took him away, and then pretty much everyone knew what was going to happen next. Turret was taken out of sight, brought behind a different rock, and then 2 quick gunshots were heard. And then, pretty soon after that, Abdul forced the rest of the hostages, the American climbers, to move behind that very same boulder in an effort to start retreating from the battle. And so now they're all crowded behind the same boulder where Turret was just shot, and his lifeless body is kind of just sitting there. And so they're trying not to look at it, of course, but I mean, it was kind of necessary to shelter themselves. And so they really had no choice but to just kind of crouch down right next to it. I mean, just brutal stuff. And so by nightfall, there was still no clear winner of this battle. And it's at this point that Abdul decided the group needed to move on for whatever reason. And so they lightened their loads as much as they possibly could. They basically just grabbed a small amount of food and then began kind of snaking their way up the mountains, dodging the occasional gunshot. The group would trek all the way until the early morning of August 13th. I mean, they basically hiked until they couldn't walk anymore. They then spent the next 16 plus hours hiding out in a few tiny caves, kind of sandwiched in there body to body with their captors, until finally night set in again and Abdul decided that it was time to get moving again. By this point, there were only 2 rebels guiding the climbers, if you will. Abdul, of course, the vicious leader, and then this other man, Sue, who had clearly taken kind of a liking to the Americans. The first thing that the group needed to do once they got moving again was cross this raging river. They wanted to kind of make their way up into the hills on the other side of it, but the problem was that the river was just too wide and too just raging for them to cross it on foot. And so Abdul and Sue kind of struggled to put in place a makeshift bridge by tossing a log across the river. But when they did this, the log only made it about halfway across and it basically got stuck. And so Abdul and Sue are kind of scrambling, searching for a solution, when all of a sudden, Jason just kind of sprang into action. I mean, you have to remember that the 4 American climbers, while they were young, they were extremely comfortable and experienced in the outdoors. Crossing dangerous rivers was something that they had all done plenty of times before. And so Jason decided to utilize his skills in this moment, much to the surprise of Tommy, Beth, and John. Jason risked his life and jumped into the river, fighting the current with every step until he was finally able to kind of push that log the rest of the way across the river, completing this makeshift bridge. Even the rebels tried to stop him, telling him that it was too dangerous, but he didn't listen, and he was successful. And so the group then crossed this precarious log one by one until finally it was Abdul's turn. In a very ironic twist, Abdul actually seemed more nervous about crossing this raging river than he did about the gun battle that he had been in the previous day. And Jason, recognizing Abdul's nervousness, actually kind of extended a hand, offering to help him as he made his way across the slippery log. Shockingly, instead of taking Jason's hand, to help him balance, Abdul actually handed him his rifle. And so for a brief moment, the automatic weapon was now in the hands of the climbers. I mean, it all happened so fast, right? Even too fast, you could say. Abdul quickly crossed the log, and before anyone really had time to think about it, the weapon, well, it was back in Abdul's hands. But even though the rebels were now back in control, this river crossing was really a massive turning point for the American climbers. They realized two very important things. First of all, they realized that Abdul and Sue were not as comfortable or skilled in the mountains as they were. I mean, this river crossing was a clear example of that. And this is something that the climbers might be able to use to escape at some point. And second of all, the climbers realized that Abdul and Sue were beginning to trust them. Why else would Abdul have handed his gun over, even just for a moment? I mean, that's crazy, right? And so maybe if the climbers worked to stay on the good side of their captors, maybe they might start to trust them a little bit too much, which the climbers could then exploit. They just needed to wait for the perfect opportunity to present itself. The next few days were absolute hell for everyone. Because they had ditched a lot of their food and their gear during the battle on the 12th, the entire group were starving, dehydrated, and freezing cold pretty much every single night. They would move across these cliffs and slopes of the mountains at night, as they didn't want to get detected. They would share what little food they had, which was mostly just leftover protein bars. They would share that stuff with their captors, again, in order to remain on their good side and continue to build that trust. They would even, this is kind of weird, but cuddle up with Abdul and Sue at night so that they could all share their body heat and stay warm. Of course, none of the four climbers enjoyed this, but at least Sue did seem a little bit thankful. The climbers did their best to just kind of bury their resentment and to assist their captors and just build that trust in any way possible. And as each day passed by, it became more and more evident that this plan was actually working, especially with Sue. You got to know that Sue was actually a very young kid. He was only about 19 years old, which was actually a little bit younger than the climbers themselves. Abdul, the leader, was a good 10 to 15 years older, right? But Sue's this young kid just like them. And as time went on, Sue began to smile more. They would even joke around with him a little bit. There were moments where it almost seemed like Sue was actually on their side. But, of course, that was an illusion. I mean, Sue was still holding them hostage via an automatic rifle all day, every day. And he was still taking orders from Abdul. And so by day 6 of their captivity, Jason, John, Tommy, and Beth were barely recognizable as the vibrant climbers who'd arrived in the area weeks earlier. They were malnourished, they were completely exhausted, and their bodies had begun breaking down to the point where they could hardly travel more than a few hundred yards per day. And of course, Abdul and Sue were in even worse shape probably, because again, they're not as comfortable traversing this difficult mountain terrain. And to make matters worse, the climbers still didn't really know where they were going. It almost seemed as though Abdul and Sue were kind of just marching them around, and had shifted their focus from reaching a final destination to just kind of simply surviving each passing hour. But on the evening of night 6, Abdul came up with a plan. The 4 American climbers and Sue would go up a mountain, climb nearly 3,000 feet up this like really steep slope, up to a predetermined meeting point. Abdul would then go off on his own, and he would go take a detour, grab some more food and some supplies, and then he would climb up the mountain by himself and meet them at their rendezvous point. And so this is what happened. They parted ways with Abdul, and just like that, Sue was now the only person that was left to guard the 4 climbers. Jason and John had been pretty openly discussing the idea of killing their captors ever since the river incident happened a few days earlier. Tommy and Beth, however, they felt differently. And that's not to say that they were like staunchly opposed to, using violence. It's just that they couldn't fathom the possibility of killing another human being, even if this is someone who is doing them harm. And even putting that aside, this was obviously extremely risky. I mean, if they tried and failed to kill the rebels, then they themselves would quickly become the ones who were getting killed. I mean, of course they would get turned on. And so all 4 of them were just silently pondering this possibility as they began to make their way up the mountain. And again, though they were tired, for the American climbers, this was a pretty routine task, right? The terrain was challenging, but it was nothing compared to what they had done before. I mean, this is literally what they came to Kyrgyzstan to do in the first place, climb. But for Sue, well, let's just say that he wasn't really much of a climber. That was crystal clear. His movements were clumsy. He struggled to keep up the pace, and he was even relying on Jason most of the time to kind of guide his hand movements, tell him where to put his hands while they climbed up this steep cliff. You have to understand that this is the kind of terrain where a fall would be fatal. I mean, there's just no other way of saying it. And the American climbers were in their element. Sue was not. Sue even slung his rifle over his back so that he could like climb more stably, more freely, but this didn't really help. And the more that Sue struggled, the more that the climbers began to kind of toy with the idea of pushing him off the cliff. Like I said a few minutes ago, Jason and John had been kind of waiting for this moment for a long time, but Beth and Tommy were absolutely terrified. I mean, Beth certainly wasn't going to be the one to do it, and Tommy didn't really think that he had it in him either. They're climbing up this steep cliff, but before they knew it, the end was basically in sight. I mean, they had almost reached the top of it. And so if anything was going to happen, it had to happen now. They were running out of time. And so Jason maneuvered himself kind of off to the side of Sue, hoping to get enough leverage to kind of push him straight off the cliff. But Sue unintentionally kind of outmaneuvered Jason. And again, Sue still had no idea about the intentions of the climbers that he was now relying on to make it up the mountain. And so at this point, they can literally see the end of the climb. I mean, there's only a few more feet to go now. And so Jason and John begin to realize that what might have been their best and last opportunity to free themselves had been squandered. But as fate would have it, the next few hours would leave zero time for this type of reflection, because in an instant, everyone gasped, a lot of them screamed, and then all of a sudden, time stood still. Flash forward a few hours later, and Jason, John, Tommy, and Beth were literally diving into a Kyrgyz army outpost building. They were then given fresh food for the first time in days, by the way. They were given water, warm clothing, and pretty much anything else that they could ask for. Against all odds, the climbers had escaped. Their nightmare was over, and they were now completely free. Over the next few days, the government of Kyrgyzstan, as well as the U.S. Embassy, well, they kind of worked together to bring the climbers back to the United States. Cameras and a lot of media attention kind of followed them around everywhere for a while after their return. Once they arrived back home, the climbers clung to their reunion with their family and loved ones, but their nervous looks and demeanor hinted at a very dark truth, a secret that they carried from that final fateful night on the mountain. And eventually, the full story would come out. And when it did, it would shock pretty much everyone. Tommy, the shy, quiet young man who would never hurt anyone, who would never harbor any violence, well, Tommy had done the unthinkable. You see, on that steep climb up the mountain with Sue, at the very top, right before they had almost finished it, Tommy glanced over at Beth, and they silently agreed that it was time to act. And so in a split second, Tommy rushed forward, he grabbed Sue's rifle strap, and he pulled him off the cliff and sent him on a 2,000-foot tumble down into the darkness. That was the last that the climbers ever saw of him. Tommy was immediately distraught after doing this. I mean, he had just taken a life. Like, how could he have done such a thing? But of course, his fellow climbers reassured him. I mean, Tommy's actions were obviously necessary. He had saved all of their lives. And also, for what it's worth, of course, they didn't know this at the time, but Sue actually survived the fall and would later go on to be arrested. And so, Tommy's desperate act, so unlike him, set the climbers free. After this, they climbed back down the mountain and they hiked and hiked and hiked until they reached that government army outpost, at which point they were finally rescued. And yet, despite his courageous act, and despite the fact that it basically saved him, it also opened up the door to years and years of trauma and hardship afterwards, which I think is very important for you all to know. Tommy and Beth would continue their careers and eventually both become household names in the world of climbing. John and Jason would go on to lead more private lives. I didn't really find too much about them, and so I think we need to respect their privacy here. And certainly, I encourage all of you to leave some love for all of them in the comments, and especially to Tommy, I guess I'll say, for acting so courageously and saving the lives of his friends. In 1973, these American climbers traveled to Argentina, hoping to summit the highest mountain in all of the Americas. But after interviewing them at their hotel, a reporter whispered a very disturbing prediction about them to his photographer. He said, quote, "Take each of their photos today, because I don't think they're all coming back." This prediction would turn out to be dead on. No pun intended. Folks, this is not just another story about a climb gone wrong. It's actually the story about the final smiling photos of people who had no idea that they were about to die. It's the story of how egos and broken trust turned a mountain into a straight up battlefield. And some people say it's the story of cold-blooded murder. But we'll get there. And as if that wasn't all traumatic enough, literally decades after this story had been completely forgotten by everybody, a bombshell discovery was made, and, well, it might just change everything. In 1972, Portland lawyer Carmi Duffo convinced his local climbing club to take on the, quote, moderately difficult climb of Aconcagua, which stands at 22,838 feet, which is about 6,961 meters. Carmi would recruit 6 men to go with him, and some of them he had climbed with before, but others were just complete strangers who had been recommended by some of his friends. However, this group would not end up just being full of men, because there was one more person who would end up joining, and she was a woman named Janet Mae Johnson. Janet, who was an elementary school teacher, she didn't appear at first glance to be a formidable climber, we'll say. But with that said, Janet was no slouch. She routinely climbed in the Rockies in Colorado, and she had even summited Kilimanjaro over in Africa. And so with hopeful eyes on Aconcagua, Janet packed her gear, which included her trusty Nicomat film camera, and she flew down to Argentina to meet her fellow climbers. Folks, this did not go well. During their very first night together in Argentina, the Americans just didn't they didn't really mesh with each other. Something just fell off. And this was despite the fact that they were still in the comfort of a hotel at this point. They weren't even on the mountain yet, being subjected to Mother Nature's whim. The group was even interviewed by local news about their upcoming expedition, but they just seemed disconnected. I don't really know how else to say it. But at least they weren't climbing alone. They actually had an experienced mountain guide named Miguel Alfonso to lead their way. So the next morning, they left the hotel and they started the journey up to base camp. And the thing you have to know about Aconcagua is that base camp is at 14,000 feet above sea level, which is about 4,300 meters. And from base camp, it's another 8,000 feet or 2,400 meters to the actual peak, right? And so when they arrived at base camp after 2 days of climbing just to get there, they were already feeling the effects of altitude. This was their plan. Carmi Defoe would lead with Miguel as his guide. A man named Jim Petrosky, who was one of Carmi's friends, he would be the deputy leader for the group. Now, one of the climbers was actually bilingual, and so he would translate between Carmi and Miguel, who only spoke Spanish, as well as another doctor. The 4 other climbers in the group were Bill Zeller, who was an American police officer, Arnold McMillan, who was a dairy farmer, and then there was John Cooper, who was a NASA engineer. Like, you heard that right. And of course, there was Janet, once again, who was the teacher. So they had their plan, but even with it, I don't know, something just still wasn't right about this group. And so when they arrived at base camp, the camp manager actually got the same feeling that the reporter had back at the hotel, that I told you about right at the beginning of the video. It was this dark feeling. There was no group attitude here. There was no camaraderie. It kind of just felt like everyone was on their own, every man for himself, right? And perhaps most importantly, even though everyone had fancy professional gear, and so they were prepared in that aspect, it just seemed like they weren't really taking this dangerous expedition as seriously as they probably should have.
The climb up Aconcagua takes
about a week, all the way up to 2 weeks, potentially. And it takes so long because there are 3 camps that you have to kind of progress to on your way up to the peak. And so during the day, you have to be kind of shuttling your gear up the mountain to these various camps. And then at the end of the day, you have to come back down to the base camp to rest. And so you add in the altitude and also the fields of these tall, icy pillars, and you have to navigate through these. You add all that stuff up, and this is obviously a very, very exhausting journey. And this became apparent very quickly because the first few days and nights of the expedition took a major toll on the Americans. And from reports of what the group dynamic was like, once again, the climbers weren't really keeping each other in great company, you could say. The vibes were just very off, as the kids would say these days. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of quiet hiking. As the air got thinner and thinner, the further and further they climbed. They reached Camp 1, but of course they were completely gassed and their spirits were very low. John Cooper, once again, this NASA engineer, he even wrote in his diary that Bill Zeller, the police officer, had been doing most of the gear shuttling. I mean, literally carrying the load, because everyone else was just so sick, tired, and exhausted. And while he did praise Bill in his writing, let's just say that John gave Janet a much less glowing review. So according to John, Janet was pretty much useless. She was mostly just kind of snapping pictures of her fellow climbers as they struggled up the mountain. You could kind of see how that's a bit annoying, right? After a night in Camp 1, they all started to climb together up to Camp 2, but it wasn't long until 3 of the Americans basically just gave in to the exhaustion. They quit. And this actually included the group's leader, Carmi Defoe, as well as their translator and the doctor in the group. All these people turned back. And that left Jim Petrosky to now be the de facto leader for the climbers. And yet, despite these setbacks, the smaller group actually fared a little bit better than when everyone was still involved. They ended up making it to Camp 3 in just a few days, and they were even able to relax for an entire day and kind of wait out a snowstorm. The very next morning, the climbers emerged from their tents, well rested. and they saw something very, very surprising. That was the summit of the mountain. The weather had done a complete 180. It was now completely clear. The sky was beautiful. The snow was even powdery, not icy, which would make it easier to climb. And so this was very, very exciting for the group. They made a big breakfast. They kind of started to get ready. And for the first time, since they had arrived in Argentina, it felt like they were actually a team, a team with this common goal. And they decided that today was the day to make the final push up the Polish glacier and reach
Aconcagua's peak.
So the climbers woke up and everyone's kind of getting ready to make that final summit push. But as they were doing this, Jim, who was now the group's new leader, well, he was kind of lagging behind. He was struggling with things as simple as just putting on his crampons, which is like an essential thing if you're going to be climbing a big mountain like this. He tried to stand up, but he could barely even do that without basically falling over. And so this was obviously very worrisome for the group. Jim was experiencing symptoms not just of altitude sickness, but of severe, potentially fatal brain swelling. And so basically, Jim needed to get to a lower elevation as soon as possible or he was going to die. But the other 4 Americans, well, they all felt great. They weren't about to give up. I mean, they'd come all this way, and so they're not going to turn back now. And so Miguel, the local guide there, the only one who actually knew the route by heart, and also the only one who didn't need the ego boost of summiting the mountain because he'd done it before, well, he decided to take Jim back down to base camp. And this selfless act probably saved Jim's life, by the way. And so now, the only 4 climbers left were Bill, the police officer, Arnold, the farmer, John, the NASA engineer, and Janet, the teacher. Both of their previous leaders had now turned around. They now had nobody in charge, really. They had no clear roles, and frankly, they had no chance in hell. Let me just say that the next series of events are a version of kind of what's been cobbled together from those who didn't die. And the stories of the survivors don't completely align with the evidence. And at some points, frankly, they don't even align with each other's stories. And so after I tell you what the survivors say happened, be sure to keep watching until the end of the video, because literally years after all of this took place, there was that insane discovery I alluded to earlier that has given us a much better sense of what actually happened on the mountain that day. But we'll get there. So Bill, Arnold, John, and Janet made a plan. They were going to climb the Polish glacier,
summit Aconcagua,
and then return to camp all before the sun went down, right? This meant about 2,000 feet or just over 600 meters of climbing. And it was only about a half a mile, by the way, a very short distance. And so they grabbed their ice axes and they lightened their packs, leaving some of their heavier gear behind, and they began climbing, right? And once again, they were trying to do all this before the sunset, and so they had to move. And I don't know if the conditions changed or if they just misjudged their energy levels, but the dark truth is that they did not move fast enough. And speaking of darkness, well, eventually it would set in. They didn't make it in time. And by the time this happened, they were still 1,000 feet or just over 300 meters away from the summit. I mean, folks, they were officially in the danger zone at this point, we'll say. Their flashlights were pretty useless against the blackness that was all around them. And once again, they packed so lightly for this final push. They didn't have any tents or sleeping bags, and they barely even had any food. And of course, this is a massive deal because obviously the climbers realized they weren't going to make it to the summit and they weren't going to be able to make it back down to their camp. And so they had no choice but to just spend the night there, completely unsheltered, right there on the glacier. This is a climber's worst nightmare. Using their ice axes, the 4 climbers quickly dug this snow cave on the side of the glacier. And then once inside, they tried their best to sleep on top of these reflective space blankets, which separated their shivering bodies from the ice beneath them a little bit, but it's still not very ideal. And it turns out that Janet and Bill just simply couldn't handle being packed in so tightly. And so they would actually end up moving outside the cave, and they literally just sat there in the bone-chilling wind all night. And yet, despite how awful this situation was, thankfully everyone survived. Well, at least for now, I'll say. And by the morning, this is also just insane, most of them decided that they were still going to try to go reach the summit. However, John, well, he came to the opposite conclusion. He told them that he was completely done. He had been miserable since Camp 1, and now at 21,000 feet, or about, 6,400 meters, with the summit right there, mind you, like in sight. Well, now he was gonna quit. He was gonna climb about 2 hours back down the glacier all the way back down to Camp 3. And with this, it seems that the fleeting camaraderie that the group had experienced the day before, well, it seems like it was rapidly depleting, we'll say. And a perfect example of this is that when John decided to turn around, nobody in the group accompanied him. No one else went with him. They left him essentially to descend all on his own. So now there's only 3 of them left, and they moved slowly but consistently up the Polish glacier. Janet continued to snap more pictures with her Nikomat film camera as they climbed further and further up. Through her camera lens, Janet saw
what looked like the peak of Aconcagua, and
they pushed further ahead towards it. However, this view through the lens was actually false hope, as another snowy ridge stood between them and the summit. It's always a little further than it seems. And folks, on this second day of pushing, they once again didn't make it. Darkness set in for the second night in a row, but this time the trio didn't just stop in camp. They decided to just keep going, right? And so the snow was about waist deep at this point, and Bill and Arnold were taking turns kind of breaking the trail ahead of them. And after doing this for some time, the men kind of turned around to go check on Janet, and they were horrified to discover that she was gone. Janet had basically vanished into the pitch black night. And so they frantically began searching. They called out her name over and over and over until finally they heard a whimpering voice off in the distance. It's at this point that they found Janet laying in the snow, way off of the route they had been following, by the way. And she was alive, but she was not doing well at all. Janet was in such bad condition that she literally asked the men to let her, quote, lay here and die. Like, let that sink in. You're gonna hear that quote again in a few minutes here. But of course, Bill didn't let her do this. He picked her up and he tied her to himself. And this is the first kind of moments, we'll say, of where versions of the story kind of start differing. One version says that the 3 of them camped together and did end up braving another freezing night. But then another version says that Arnold went further up ahead of Bill and Janet and then spent the night by himself. Regardless of which one of those versions is true, it was still another freezing night on the glacier. Once again, no tent, at this point, no food, no sleeping bags, and somehow, miraculously, all 3 of them survived the night again. But at this point, Janet was in even worse shape now. I mean, her hands were swollen and black, frostbitten, and frankly, Bill wasn't looking so great either. His face was literally getting blackened from sun exposure at this point. And so with Janet barely hanging on, Bill and Arnold finally made the decision to turn back. And folks, it's worth mentioning that at this point, they were only about 200 feet or about 61 meters from the summit. They were right there. They were so close. But they had no choice. They had to turn around. And so Janet, who was still tied to Bill, was really, really struggling on the way down. They managed to get past that snow cave they had dug a few nights previously. Arnold even fired off a flare gun that had been left behind in a last-ditch effort to try to get rescued. But of course, no one saw it. No one came to help them. And so Bill was basically carrying Janet down the mountain, and Arnold would end up going ahead of the group because he was moving faster and he hoped that he could get to help more quickly. And so he was kind of booking it down the mountain, right? As fast as he could anyways. And at one point, he says that he fell down a very steep section of the glacier, claiming that he slid headfirst for 1,000 feet or just over 300 meters. and this fall caused him to lose his ice axe and gave him a black eye. He then limped the rest of the way down the mountain as Camp 3 finally came into his vision. But as he was making this final short leg of the trek, he started to hear things. He started to hear voices and see members of the Argentine army passing him to go and rescue Janet and Bill. He started to see lots of things, things like dead mules scattered all around him. And perhaps most strikingly, he saw a soldier sitting there with his head in his hands just off of the trail. Now, as you probably guessed, most of these sounds and sights did not actually happen. He was hallucinating. But one of the things he saw was actually partially based in reality. Later that night, as Arnold was laying comfortably in his sleeping bag and his tent for the first time in a while, all of a sudden he just woke up with a jolt, and the truth kind of just hit him. That dead soldier that he thought he had seen, well, it wasn't actually a soldier. It was John Cooper. Remember, John had left the group sometime earlier and he hadn't been seen or heard from since. In the meantime, Bill and Janet were taking their time as they went down. And at one point, Bill started to actually hallucinate as well. He was hearing voices of phantoms who promised to rescue them. He was seeing construction trucks parked on the mountain. And all of a sudden, Bill kind of snapped out of it. But that's when he says that he and Janet also took a fall. And folks, this one was much, much worse. Remember, the two of them are tied together, but when they fell, of course, this rope came undone. And so they go tumbling, and after Bill eventually stopped and kind of took a second to take stock and kind of see how far he had fallen, he looked down in front of him and was actually stunned to see that Camp 3 was right there. He was that close to safety. But since he had fallen further down than Janet did, he actually turned around and went back up to try and go check on her. But before he could even reach her, Bill reached someone else, and this, of course, was John Cooper. According to Bill, John didn't have any cuts on his skin, he didn't have any tears in his clothing, and he sat kind of facing the direction of the tents down in Camp 3. And it was unclear what had happened, but one thing was clear as day, and that was that John Cooper was dead. And so Bill makes this determination, and then he keeps going up to try to find Janet. And fortunately, he did find her alive, shaken up certainly, but she was okay. She had the wind knocked out of her from falling and her glasses were broken. But overall, she was fine, right? And so she was sitting there taking a moment to recover. And this is where one of the more questionable decisions was made, right? And so Bill, who had been carrying everyone pretty much from the get-go, who pretty much saved Janet's life earlier, well, Bill decided to leave Janet there so that he could go down and set up a tent for them at Camp 3. He assumed that she would just take a moment to get her stuff together and then she would follow him when she was ready. And it's easy to criticize in hindsight, obviously, but I don't know. You can understand why this was at least a little bit of a questionable decision, right? And it doesn't really stop there either, because the next questionable decision was that, according to the survivors, when Bill arrived at Camp 3 and met Arnold there, they crawled into their tents and then they just kind of slept through the night. Whether it was due to exhaustion or delusion from the altitude, for whatever reason, they didn't wait up for Janet. And it wasn't until the very next morning, when they woke up, that they finally realized that she hadn't made it, and they started searching for her, but they didn't see anything. They searched for a little while, and then finally they decided to go further down the mountain. And again, it's easy to criticize this stuff when you weren't there and you're not suffering, from altitude sickness and all this stuff, but I don't know. According to Arnold, Bill was so confused that he literally had no idea what direction to even travel. So you can kind of understand the state that they're in, but still, they did kind of leave her there. Janet never made it back down to base camp. 8 climbers in this group went up the mountain, but only 6 of them came back down. John Cooper was dead, and Janet, of course, was assumed dead as well because she had completely vanished after Bill last saw her. John and Janet's bodies remained on the mountain, and as the tragic news began to spread, a media firestorm would be ignited. Questions about this failed expedition followed the survivors everywhere they went, frankly, and they tripped up anyone who tried to get some straight answers, which included the US and the Argentine government, as well as, of course, the families of the dead. I mean, John Cooper was a son, a father, and husband, and at NASA, he was active through the entire Apollo program. Janet Johnson was a beloved daughter. Her mother would collect newspaper clippings about this whole story, and if there was ever any misspelling of Janet's name, her mother would literally cross them out and correct them. And actually, speaking of crossing things out, she was so sickened by her daughter's mysterious death that whenever she saw Janet's quote, where she asked to, quote, be left to die on the mountain, I told you about earlier. Well, whenever her mother saw this in the newspaper, she would immediately cross it out. She couldn't even stand to look at it, right? Both of these families wanted answers about how their loved ones died. Things just didn't really seem to add up. And also, both families wanted their bodies retrieved. Unfortunately, these two things were gonna have to wait because the climbing season was coming to an end. Any attempt to recover the bodies was gonna have to, take place next year. It was too late now. And so the first people under the gun for answers about what happened were the survivors. When Jim Petrosky and Miguel Alfonso turned back down the mountain, John and Janet were still alive. And so the only real potential witnesses to their deaths would have been Bill Zeller and Arnold McMillan. And, based on the story I just told you, they weren't exactly the most reliable narrators, and they didn't really give a ton of clarity to the US or the Argentine government. Once everyone got back to Portland, Oregon, Carmi Defoe's climbing club, the ones that kind of organized this entire disaster expedition in the first place, well, they held this secret meeting to kind of get ahead of the press and kind of get everyone's story straight, right? And after that meeting, the story that each of the surviving climbers would tell the media and their hometown newspapers was that Janet and John were desperate to reach the summit and that they, quote, probably died of pulmonary edema, which is basically when your lungs fill up with fluid. It's a story that, in theory, does kind of make some sense, and it did answer a number of questions, we'll say, at the time. However, that didn't last very long, because in late 1973, Miguel Alfonso and a crew of other Argentine climbers decided to go back up the mountain to try to find the bodies. And though this wasn't an easy task, they were successful. They came upon what was left of Camp 3 at the time, and it was just kind of windswept, just kind of gear strewn everywhere. And only about 150 yards further uphill from the camp, they found what they came for. They found the frozen body of John Cooper. And they also found his diary. However, what they didn't find was Janet. There was no sign of her anywhere. And here's where things really start to get shaken up, folks. When they found John's body, he was not positioned how Bill and Arnold had said he was earlier. He wasn't sitting like they said. His legs were actually fully extended. And his hands were kind of laying across his midsection, not up kind of towards his face like they had said earlier. And upon a closer look, new details emerged, ones that showed that John didn't die of pulmonary edema like Carmi Defoe had claimed. John's face was battered and he had this horrified look on his face. He looked terrified, and most disturbingly, his hands covered a circular hole in his abdomen, which was bloody and very, very deep. The initial theory about this hole was that John had must have fallen very hard on his ice axe, and as he attempted to examine this painful wound, he basically just went unconscious and died. But another theory quickly emerged. A theory from the very person who actually performed John's autopsy. The coroner said that the wound could not have come from an ice axe handle, which is a rectangular shape. The only object that could have made a circular wound like this was an ice screw. An ice screw driven deeply into his body by someone else. But the autopsy report was even more shocking than that. Ultimately, John's cause of death was not even that wound in his abdomen. Of course, it wasn't the fluid in his lungs like they claimed earlier. It wasn't even hypothermia. The cause of his death was, get this, cranial contusions, injuries to his brain and his skull. This, coupled with that wound, opened up a brand new, unbelievable idea. What if the mountain didn't actually kill John? What if it wasn't an accident? What if somebody else had killed him? We're talking about murder here, folks. And now the pressure was on to find Janet's body, which was basically the next piece of the puzzle for this climbing disaster, now turned possible murder mystery. 2 full climbing seasons went by.
Dozens of people climbed Aconcagua,
but nobody ever found Janet. That is, until February of 1975, when a 17-year-old was descending from the mountain with his father and a family friend, and he saw something red kind of stuck in one of those fields of ice pillars. Upon inspection, it would turn out that the red was Janet's jacket. And of course, goes without saying, but inside of her jacket was her body. She was laying face up, tangled in rope, missing a crampon, and her ice axe was nowhere to be found. Her boot was slashed in several places as well, which is strange. And she was found within about 100 feet, or say 30 meters, of where John was found. Bit of a warning for you here. Janet was in worse condition, we'll say, than John was. And so if you don't want to hear a description of her, then you can skip ahead about 15 seconds and miss that. But anyways, you good? Okay. So Janet's body was kind of stuck to the ice beneath her, right? And her face was blackened from all the sun exposure over the years. The skin was even lifted off her nose and her forehead, her chin. Her nose was even broken. And lying on top of her body was this singular fist-sized rock. This was a very, very strange find, and it brings up a lot of questions. And so Bill had said that he and Janet had this like long fall down the mountain, right? But the area that her body was found in was actually quite shallow. And the slashes on Janet's boot didn't really look like they were naturally caused. You know, they almost looked intentional, right? And her only wounds were to her face, which is strange because she allegedly took several falls. I mean, wouldn't she have more than just 3 wounds on her face if that was the case? But maybe the weirdest finding of all was that rock I just told you about. There were no other rocks around in this giant ice field. So how did a fist-sized rock end up on top of Janet's body? What is that? Is this a coincidence? Is it a tribute? Was it a weapon? I mean, who knows? And then, folks, the autopsy report came in, which stated that Janet, too, had died of cranial injuries. The same thing as John. Like, something just didn't add up here. And at the time, the media had basically accepted the deaths of John and Janet as climbing accidents. I mean, these things do happen. You know, maybe it was easier that way instead of wondering if something uglier had occurred. But despite this narrative, there were some people that were unconvinced. Both Bill and Arnold, once again, admitted to experiencing hallucinations, you know, voices and visions, things like that. And we know that psychosis at that altitude can lead to illogical actions. Maybe even, and this is a big maybe, but maybe even violent impulses. I mean, I don't know. This obviously needed to be investigated a lot further, but before these possible murders could even be investigated, the world shifted. Argentina's government was overrun by a military coup, and just a year after Janet's body was found, well, the case was essentially buried. The dead were put to rest, John back home in Kansas, and Janet by the trailheads of Aconcagua. Over the years, people would talk every now and again and make up stories about what might have happened. You know, maybe it was this love triangle between John, Janet, and Bill and Arnold that went wrong. But of course, that theory doesn't really make sense because, first of all, Janet was a lesbian. She wasn't attracted to men. And also, as was written in his diary, John didn't really care for Janet very much. And so that didn't really make sense. You know, maybe there was like a serial killer on the mountain that was trying to like secretly rob climbers and steal money. But of course, that's ridiculous too. I mean, climbing Aconcagua is hard enough, but sneaking up and down the mountain, stealing stuff, like that's That's ridiculous. If I had made this video a few years ago, this would have been the end of the story. But it's not, because as fate would have it, almost 50 years after the mysterious deaths of John and Janet, a bombshell discovery was made, and it held the power to completely rewrite everything that I've told you thus far. In February of 2020, a young porter found an item sitting on top of an ice pillar, and he was kind of unsure what it was, and so he brought it back to a more experienced guide down in their campsite. And when this guide saw it, he was completely shocked, and he also knew exactly what it was immediately. He held in his hands right there a Nikomat camera, and the name Janet Mae Johnson was written across it. Oh, and guess what? There was film inside of it. Now, this camera wasn't the only thing that was found that day. This is a little gruesome, but when those amateur climbers back in 1975 found Janet and tried to, take her body off the mountain, they accidentally left her arm behind. Kind of gross, I know, but 44 years later, these guys that found the camera also found this detached arm, which was still stuck inside the jacket. And in the jacket's pocket, they found 2 more canisters of film. And folks, this film was obviously a massive deal, because the photos, if they could be developed, and that's a big if, well, the photos might answer all these questions about the mystery, or at least some of them, and they might even tell us how John and Janet died. The film was analyzed, and it turns out that by some miracle, almost 50 years later, they were still able to develop it. It had been sitting there on the mountain for almost 50 years, but they got it. And so, folks, what I have for you right here are photos taken by Janet Mae Johnson. There's shots of the mountain, those ice pillars I've talked about, the landscape, but there's also pictures of her fellow climbers, capturing just about every stage of their journey. Some were action shots, some show the climbers posing, and some even show Janet herself. She even took photos of Arnold and Bill after John had already turned around and descended. From these photos, we can take away a few new pieces of information. Some people say that the photos show that
The snow on Aconcagua
was very soft, meaning that the long falls and slides down the mountain that Bill and Arnold described would not have just been improbable, but were actually impossible. And in this photo,
we can actually see Janet nearing the peak of Aconcagua
the day before her disappearance. You can even see that she's tied to the person who took the photo by rope. And this is a bit curious because, once again, didn't Bill and Arnold say that Janet was kind of struggling and that she was behind them for most of the climb? We heard a lot about this group of climbers being disconnected, lacking camaraderie, every man and one woman for themselves. But the discovery of these photos reveal that Janet must have had at least some sort of connection with her fellow climbers. I mean, she cared enough about them to document them as part of her journey. And John, in his diary, well, he cared enough to praise Bill for all of his hard work and to show concern about the sick party members. And even though he didn't love Janet necessarily, well, he even admired some of her quirks. The last surviving member of this expedition died in 2023, and so we may never know what really happened on Aconcagua, even with these photos, unfortunately. But all of the pieces of this puzzle, the misaligned accounts, the altitude psychosis, the strange wounds in that rock, and of course the photos from Janet's camera, all of this stuff tell us that the real story of Aconcagua is definitely not the one that's widely accepted, or certainly was published way back when. Everglades is one of the most beautiful national parks in all of the United States. It's also a literal playground for murderers.
A man accused of shooting at park rangers inside Everglades National Park.
Drew Curtis Sykes
is facing charges for allegedly firing 50 rounds with an AK-47 at park rangers.
Everglades was once the home of one of the most notorious serial killers of all time until one day he himself was killed by an angry mob. A Florida man once hired a 26-year-old woman to kill his ex-girlfriend, but before she could even act, she herself was killed, found dead, dumped inside Everglades National Park. Some people claim that there have been almost 200 bodies dumped in the Everglades just in the last few decades, and that's only the ones that were found. A local police captain was asked about this very thing, to which he said, quote, "It's a convenient place to dump people because there are gators out there to eat them." Everglades National Park has a massive murder problem, and yet nobody outside of Florida seems to really be talking about it. Murder is so deeply ingrained in Everglades National Park's history that it goes all the way back to the year 1892. We're gonna start here and follow this park's trail of bodies all the way to the present day, where some of the most disturbing murders, deaths, and of course disappearances in national park history have taken place. Especially the last one, by the way, which literally makes no sense at all. But first, there's this campsite in Everglades National Park called Watson Place. And if you're just glancing at a backcountry map, it probably looks like any other peaceful spot along the river. But what you have to understand is that this campsite is named after a literal serial killer. His name was Edgar Watson, and some people say that he committed his first murder at just 9 years old. Born in 1855, his dad was a drunk Civil War vet who routinely beat him senseless. And over the years, Edgar kind of just bounced around through various states. I'm talking South Carolina, Oklahoma, Texas, and he left a trail of bodies wherever he went. By 1891, Edgar had arrived to Florida, where he was promptly arrested for killing a man named Quinn Bass. By some stroke of luck, the jury would actually end up acquitting him. But then he was arrested again, this time for killing a man named Sam Toland, and somehow the jury acquitted Edgar Watson again. After the second acquittal, he finally settled down in a place where nobody would really ask many questions about what he was up to. A place where he knew that he could continue killing without having to be placed in front of one of those pesky juries, right? Edgar Watson decided to settle down where else but right in the heart of the Everglades. He bought land, he grew sugarcane, and he hired various workers from all over Florida. But what these workers didn't understand is that they weren't just farmhands, they were literal targets. Edgar quickly developed a habit, we'll say, of hiring men with no families and no one to miss them. He'd work them hard, and then when they asked him to pay, well, he would just kill them instead. Eventually, the locals did begin to catch on. Rumors began to swirl, but at least for the moment, no one ever dared to actually challenge Edgar Watson. At least, not until the Tucker family came along. The Tuckers had actually been farming a patch of land along Lossman's River for literal years, but Edgar all of a sudden claimed that it was actually his. He told them to leave his property immediately, but the family refused and said that they would stay until after they had finished harvesting their crops. For Edgar, this was completely unacceptable, and so he murdered the entire family, which, wasn't exactly out of the ordinary for him, but little did he know that this particular act of incredible violence was actually going to be the beginning of his end. The locals had been scared of Edgar for years, but now it was personal. A group of them even went to the sheriff all the way in Fort Myers, but they were then told that nothing could be done. It was a different jurisdiction, right? And so that pretty much left them with no other option, and, well, they would end up taking matters into their own hands. On October 24th, 1892, Edgar sailed into the Everglades town of Chokoloskee, totally unaware that an angry mob was there waiting for him. I mean, word had gotten around, right? They weren't just gonna let him walk away and continue to kill this time. And so when Edgar stepped off of his boat, he was quickly confronted, and some words were exchanged, and eventually he would end up raising his shotgun towards the crowd, pulling the trigger, but nothing happened. It would turn out that it was a misfire. I mean, what are the odds of that, right? And so then Edgar quickly reached for his revolver on his hip, but by then it was too late. The crowd absolutely unloaded on Edgar. Bullets tore through him and he dropped dead right there on the spot before the crowd would end up dragging his body all the way to Rabbit Key and dumping him in a shallow grave. And in a totally astonishing move, despite Edgar Watson's history of violence and murder, you know, him literally being a serial killer, the National Park Service turned his homestead into a campsite that anyone can visit to this day. Edgar Watson may have been the first person to turn the Everglades into a graveyard, but he sure as hell was not the last. I mean, after he died, the bodies continued to stack up, and the truth is that people continue to vanish to this day. So Edgar Watson's legacy didn't just stain the water of the Everglades, it pretty much set the tone for everything that would come after, including the murder of a man named Guy Bradley. So this dude started out as just a young kid hunting birds for cash, but by the year 1903, well, he'd actually completely switched sides, going from the hunter to the person responsible for patrolling the hunter and making sure they're following the laws, aka a game warden. He was actually Florida's first ever game warden. He would chase poachers through the mangroves with nothing but a sailboat and a pistol. This was his job. And while I hope we all respect game wardens today, well, back then it was a total different story. And so this new job that he was so passionate about, well, it would not end well for Guy. Guy had an old neighbor who was named Walter Smith, and Guy had actually arrested Walter's son not once, but 2 different times. And so after this, Walter warned Guy, quote, "If you ever arrest one of my boys again, I will kill you." And tragically, he would end up making good on that threat, shooting Guy Bradley dead, dumping his body in Guy's own boat, and then just kind of pushing him out for the tide to carry away forever. And while Guy Bradley's murder did help spark conservation laws across the country, it definitely did not stop the bloodshed in the Everglades. The killings did not stop. They just got quieter and eventually more anonymous. I'm talking Jane Does, shallow graves. I mean, that's the stuff that we're about to touch on next year, because the truth is that the Everglades still has bodies. You just have to know where to look. In the year 1969, someone in South Florida had the misfortune, we'll say, of being bound, stuffed inside a wooden trunk, doused with gasoline, and then set on fire. And while the specific location of the killing remains unclear, the charred body was discovered where else but in the Everglades. And as if that wasn't already crazy enough, investigators quickly came out with a theory about the identity of this particular person that was, well, you'll see. Folks, this was not your typical Jane Doe. Investigators initially believed that the charred body was actually that of Ruth Eisman Shear, who was the very first woman in history to be placed on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. And the way that she ended up on that list will probably keep you up for a long time. So the previous year, Ruth and her then boyfriend, who was named Gary Christ, grabbed a 20-year-old college student named Barbara Mackle right out of her hotel room at gunpoint. They then proceeded to bury her alive in a fiberglass coffin with very little food, water, and just a few little air tubes and a flashlight. Barbara was stuck underground for 83 hours, while Ruth and Gary demanded $500,000 in a ransom payment from her wealthy father. Barbara spent 3.5 days lying in the dark, using this tiny flashlight to kind of just keep track of time and to just kind of keep herself alive, right? And somehow, when the FBI finally found her, she was still breathing. She somehow survived this insane ordeal, and Gary was caught just a few days later, but Ruth managed to pretty much drop off the face of the earth, which ultimately drove the FBI to add her to the 10 most wanted list. She remained completely undetected all the way into early 1969, and she matched the description of this Everglades Jane Doe that was found in the wooden coffin. And so they really believed for a while that she was the Jane Doe. However, after further investigation, it was eventually determined that the Jane Doe was not actually Ruth Eisman Shear, who would end up being arrested all the way over in Oklahoma just a few short days later. And disturbingly enough, the identity of this Jane Doe remains unknown to this day. And tragically, she is not the only one. In early 1975, a peaceful family getaway turned into an absolute horror story when the family's young son found not one, but 2 rotting bodies off of a dirt road in Big Cypress National Preserve, just north of the Everglades National Park border. Just like the previous Jane Doe I told you about, these bodies have also never been identified. And then you want to flash forward to 2004, when yet another Jane Doe was found, and her remains were accompanied by like multiple Catholic symbols, including like a cross and stuff like that. And what made this one a little bit more unique was that, unlike most of the other unidentified bodies, this particular Jane Doe was found in an area that is completely inaccessible to vehicles. Like, someone couldn't have just driven out there to dump her body. And so it's unclear if this particular Jane Doe was actually a murder victim or just experienced an accident in the backcountry or something like that. I'm not really sure. But for this next particular case, well, we definitely know that it was in fact murder. I'm talking about this woman right here. Her name is Marissa Karp, and just as you suspected, she was found dumped in the Everglades. In the year 2002, the 17-year-old was found stuffed inside of a green garbage bag and, just dumped off in a canal off of Alligator Alley. She'd been shot once in the chest and then just thrown away like garbage, which is horrible, right? So Marissa had spent much of her life kind of bouncing around in the foster system, and eventually she started to kind of run with the wrong crowd, and evidently, well, she fell in with some drug dealers who had ties to a ring in the Bahamas. And coincidentally, the night before she disappeared, she had actually gotten into a fight with one of these men, whose name I'm gonna butcher, but I believe it's Elian Ingram, something like that. I don't even care. This guy's a scumbag. So she gets into this fight with this bad dude, and then right after that, well, she vanished off of the face of the earth. Her body would end up turning up miles away in the swamp of the Everglades, of course. And something that's quite disturbing is that it took the police weeks just to even identify her, just to even figure out who she was. And so at this point, everything in the investigation pointed to a very specific group of guys, all involved with that drug ring I just told you about. And one of the other men, whose name I'm also gonna butcher, but I also don't care, Almonto Coakley, again, total scumbag. Well, this dude was actually suspected in a different murder, a double homicide, in fact, which happened just months later. He would end up skipping town and going back to the Bahamas, where he would ultimately end up dead himself, shot in the street before he could ever be dragged back to the US to face justice. Meanwhile, Ingram was finally arrested for ambushing and killing a sheriff's deputy. But here's the thing, he's serving time for this cop's death, as he should, but he's not serving time for Marissa's. In fact, nobody is. Her murder remains unsolved to this day, and that's despite her father, Gary, putting up billboards, offering rewards, and even going to the Bahamas himself to try to get some answers. But tragically, nothing has worked out so far. Every lead has either disappeared or ended up dead. And so another murder in the Everglades slipped through the cracks. And trust me, the stories don't stop here, because next we're getting into another Everglades murder, and this one is somehow even more brutal than all of the rest. So in 2007, a fisherman spotted something kind of floating along in a canal. It was something wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, and it literally had alligators circling around it. Turns out, it was a human head. No other body parts were found, no ID was found. The cops had almost nothing to work with in this case, except for that plastic bag. They would end up tracing it all the way back to a grocery store chain in New York. And with this information, investigators took a long shot and started digging all the way up the East Coast. And folks, that's when things started to get weird. A guy in this shady Florida motel would end up coming forward and saying that his 2 sketchy roommates had been bragging about killing a woman and then dumping her body for the Gators to find. These two losers were named Paul Trucchio and Robert Mackey, and they had met while they were both in prison, of course, and then they got out and they worked various odd jobs together, and then somehow they thought that they could get away with murder. Eventually, the bag, a New York license plate that they tossed off of a bridge, and of course, a few jailhouse confessions, well, all of this stuff pointed towards the victim being one particular woman whose name was Lorraine Hatzakorzian. Lorraine was a 41-year-old single mom from Long Island, New York, and she had left New York with these two dudes, Paul and Robert, just before she vanished. How convenient is that? Now, no one knows exactly what happened, and to be honest with you, I'm not even sure if I'd want to know like all of the fine details, but we do know that somewhere along this route from New York to Florida, something went horribly wrong. The police believe that these two men beat Lorraine unconscious, dismembered her, and then dumped her body along the way. Only her head was ever found, and even today, the rest of her body is still missing. Investigators tried for months to get Robert and Paul to talk, to confess, and instead of doing this, the two of them essentially played games. They lied. Even after they were arrested, they sent the police on these wild goose chases where they would lie about where the rest of Lorraine's body was located and just wasted everyone's time. And it gets a lot worse. So witnesses said that after killing Lorraine, Paul and Robert would sit outside of their motel room patting this little alligator statue that they called the alligator god. And they would literally pray to this alligator statue that the real gators would find the rest of Lorraine's body and erase all of the evidence. Folks, that's the kind of evil that the Everglades hides, and we're not done yet. In February of 2020, a fisherman found the body of 26-year-old Brianna Slabo rotting face down within the borders of Everglades National Park. By this point, Brianna had been missing for days, and at first it looked like a simple drug overdose, a tragic end for this young woman who was struggling with addiction. That's what the official report says anyways, but when investigators started to dig a little bit deeper, the story got way messier and frankly way darker. It turns out that Brianna was not just some random addict. She was actually tangled up in a murder for hire plot. Now, by this point, her father Michael was still trying to kind of just figure everything out. Brianna had been talking about working as a private investigator for a man named Daniel Slater. She had been doing things like renting cars, making weird trips, and hanging out with some shady people associated with Daniel. And as it would turn out, Daniel Slater, a 51-year-old suburban landscaper, well, he had a lot more going on in his life than just landscaping. Daniel was plotting something extremely evil. According to the FBI, he was paying people to stalk and kill his ex-girlfriend and members of her family. He suggested drive-by shootings. He suggested acid attacks. Daniel Slater talked about these evil acts like he was just simply ordering pizza. In early February, presumably while she was out working for Daniel, Brianna was arrested for driving a stolen car. She was also carrying a handgun at the time, and she was so distraught that after she was released from jail, her family would end up involuntarily committing her to a psychiatric hospital. She was released on February 17th, and then 3 days later, she left to go meet Daniel Slater. After this, of course, she vanished, all the way up until her body was found inside the national park on the 20th. But it gets worse. So Daniel actually was never charged with killing Brianna, but investigators did call him a suspect. And the more that they kind of looked into him, the uglier and uglier things got. Because it turns out, even after Brianna's death, Daniel Slater kept trying to hire more people. He kept offering cash and drugs to anyone who was willing to take out his ex, and he even coached them on how to fake the crime scene. His plan was pretty simple. Shoot the ex's family through their window, then spray paint Black Lives Matter across the house to make it look like some kind of weird political hit. I don't know. I say it's simple, but it's really just stupid, to be honest. And the FBI managed to actually get an informant that was inside Daniel's circle. And finally, after months of setting traps, they arrested him. Ultimately, Daniel Slater pled guilty to the murder for hire charges, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But as far as Breonna's death, well, it's still officially ruled as an overdose. There were never any murder charges or any real justice. But here's the biggest twist in this entire plot. So it turns out that before she died, Breonna had confessed to the police that Daniel Slater hadn't just hired her as this private investigator. No, he had hired her to stalk, kidnap, and kill his ex-girlfriend. Breonna completely admitted that Daniel had pulled her into a full-blown murder for hire plot. She admitted that she was supposed to be his assassin. And then, of course, shortly after making this confession, she's found dead and dumped in Everglades National Park. Breonna's story is scary and very, very heartbreaking. And sadly, it's not the last, because as brutal as it's already been up to this point, the next case out of the Everglades is quite possibly the biggest coincidence in national park history. In the summer of 2011, rangers at Everglades National Park noticed something very, very strange. They saw a dark green pickup truck sitting abandoned near Pine Glades Lake, baking in the sun for literal days. When they finally ran the license plates, it came back to a man named Jacob Olivier, who was a 23-year-old from Texas. And though his truck was left sitting there in the parking lot, Jacob himself was nowhere to be found. And even more concerningly, there was zero sign of him anywhere. There was no footprints. There was no signs of a struggle. All there was his stuff locked inside of his truck, a hotel receipt from Daytona Beach, and a whole lot of unanswered questions. At this point, Jacob's family had no clue that he was even in Florida. He'd been living with his dad and his stepmom in Texas, trying to stay clean after a stint in rehab. But then, somewhere along the way, Jacob decided to make an impromptu trip over to Savannah, Georgia, hoping to rekindle things with an old girlfriend. Folks, this did not go well. When Jacob arrived in Savannah, he learned that not only was this former girlfriend not interested, but she was actually seeing someone new entirely. So, presumably heartbroken, Jacob hit the road again. And without any clear plan, he somehow ended up alone in the middle of Everglades National Park. This is hours away from Savannah, by the way. They're not close together. And so, inside of Jacob's truck, park rangers found a gun case, but there was no gun inside of it, which is not a good sign. There weren't any drugs found either, even though Jacob had a history with addiction. A surveillance camera even caught him driving into the Everglades right around 1 p.m. His cell phone's last ping was at 4:45 p.m., but then there was total silence. When park rangers realized Jacob's truck hadn't moved in days, a professional search was launched. I'm talking helicopters, canines, and of course trackers on the ground. And one thing that is a bit astonishing, to be honest, is that the police never contacted Jacob's family, even after the search for him was on, even after they knew he was missing. His mother was quoted saying, "I found out from a news reporter that called me and said, 'Are you aware your son is missing in the Everglades?'" And this must have come as a double shock, because not only was her son missing, which is shocking enough, obviously, but Jacob had literally zero ties to the Everglades at all. It was completely random. Like, why was he there? And of course, it was also very, very concerning. And so despite this massive search, no sign of Jacob ever turned up. And so just like that, he became yet another missing person in a place that is quietly becoming infamous for erasing people forever. But here's where things start to get even weirder. Folks, Jacob wasn't the only one. Just 5 months earlier, 67-year-old Roger Sawyer had been traveling with his family through the Flamingo district of the Everglades. And at one point, they stopped to kind of just stretch their legs. They were on this road trip, and they briefly split up with Roger for around 20 minutes as they all kind of went off and did their own thing. Roger would walk away and then was promptly never seen again to this day. Both of these cases got heavy initial searches, right? You know, I already said it. Planes, canines, search teams, all these things. They combed every trail, every patch of water, every stretch of mangroves that could possibly be reached. And yet, nothing. At this point, it's hard not to wonder, right? I mean, Two men, different ages, different backgrounds, disappearing in the same national park just months apart. No trace of either of them, no witnesses. Two healthy men walked into the Everglades and never walked out in the same place at nearly the same time. And with that said, I won't get ahead of myself. It's probably just a coincidence, right? One of the biggest coincidences in national park history, mind you, but it probably is a coincidence. And yet at the same time, it does make you wonder what else Everglades National Park is hiding. This 17-year-old girl woke up in the middle of the Amazon rainforest in excruciating pain. Her last memory was being in free fall with the dense jungle canopy thousands of feet below her and getting closer very, very fast. But the question of how a plane carrying 92 people fell out of the sky, that was not on her mind. The only question now was how she was gonna survive. Which for her meant navigating the endless Amazon rainforest all by herself. Folks, this is the story of a hike I hope none of us will ever have to take. Because even if you were in the best shape of your life, no one would want to endure what Julianne Kopka had to. We're talking about a teenage girl who should have died a dozen different ways. But in this moment, while she's laying on the ground of the Amazon rainforest all by herself, the only thing that mattered was what she would do next. It's Christmas Eve of 1971. 17-year-old Julianne Kopka, a German high school student, was boarding Lanza Flight 508 with her mother Maria from Lima to Pucallpa in Peru. Their destination? Well, that was a remote panguana research station where Juliana's father, Hans Wilhelm Kopka, a zoologist, was waiting for them to celebrate the holidays together as a family. Juliana had just graduated from high school and was excited to join her family in the jungle. And this wasn't just because she missed her father. Juliana also wanted to go into animal studies, just like her dad. And so what better place to observe wild animals than in the Amazon jungle? Well, little did she know, she was about to have some very close animal encounters. You could even say that these encounters were too close. Juliana and her mother were flying with the airline Lanza, which, let's just say, didn't really have a great reputation. I mean, there's budget airlines, right? And then there's Lanza. I mean, just a year before all of this happened, a Lanza plane crashed due to engine failure, and in that case, the plane was actually over capacity with passengers. But Juliana and her mother's Christmas trip was pretty last minute, and so this was probably the only affordable option left for them. I mean, surely just one short, only an hour-long flight on Lanza would be safe, even if the airline was a little bit sketchy, right? There was a thunderstorm brewing in the area right as they planned to take off. But with the pressure of holiday travelers, you know how that can be, the flight crew decided to just risk it, which they immediately regretted. The turbulence on this plane was just unlike anything you can even imagine. The airplane was being tossed around like a toy. Overhead compartments were flying open. Passengers were literally holding onto their seats for dear life. And my apologies if you're watching this at the airport right now, especially if you're about to board a flight, because, I mean, yeah, this obviously sounds like a total nightmare. And then 20 minutes into the flight, the absolute worst case scenario happened. A jolt of lightning struck the Lanza plane, the right wing caught on fire, and then the plane began to not just go down, but to straight up disintegrate. Like, I don't know how else to say this. The pilot's attempts to level the plane out only made things worse, as the left wing of the plane then snapped off. And of course, it was now clear to everyone on board what was about to happen. One of the last things that Juliana remembered was her mother sitting in the seat next to her saying, quote, "Now it's all over." Juliana opened her eyes. Her vision was blurry as her glasses were now gone, but somehow Juliana had defied the odds and the laws of gravity and survived a 10,000 foot plunge from the sky all the way down to the ground. And as she looked around, a very horrifying reality was setting in. She was completely alone. There was no one else around her. None of the 92 souls on board were anywhere to be found, not even her mother, Maria, who again had been sitting right next to her. It occurred to Juliana that when the plane disintegrated midair, people or bodies were basically just scattered across the dense jungle. But I guess Lanza did at least one thing right, because Juliana was still somehow strapped into her seatbelt. She was sitting in a window seat, which was attached to the two other seats in her row. And this is a very important detail because if you think about it, one person in one chair would fall very fast, most likely, not making it past impact. But one person in a chair with two empty seats spinning above them creates some drag, which slowed the fall. But maybe I'm overthinking this, because the bottom line is that Juliana got extremely lucky. So after she unbuckled herself, the first thing she did, of course, was look around for her mother. But with each little step that she took, she began to realize how much pain she was in. Her knee was badly sprained. She had a deep cut on her arm. She touched her collarbone and immediately crumbled to the ground. It was broken. And on top of all that, she was most definitely concussed, like severely concussed. Terrified, alone, and badly injured, Juliana decided to kind of just rest there in the crash site. During that sleepless night, she came to the conclusion that she just had to kind of put this tragedy out of her mind. She had to block it out. And also, despite how hard it was, she had to let go of the idea that she could search and somehow save her mom, because she knew that any extra minute that she spent searching for her mom meant more time that she would have to spend in the unforgiving jungle. In her head, her badly concussed head, only one thought came through, which was, I need to get the hell out of this jungle. Despite somehow surviving the unsurvivable, a brutal, violent plane crash, the truth is that the real nightmare for Juliana was actually just getting started now. When Juliana woke up the next morning, which actually happened to be Christmas morning, just to add insult to injury, she began to prepare for this unknown, treacherous hike that she had ahead of her. She started by checking where she was. She recognized the sounds of birds and bugs, and she figured out that she was somewhere in the Panguana jungle. Now, for most of us, myself at least, I can speak for myself here, this would feel like a death sentence, right? But for Juliana, it actually gave her a little bit of comfort. It almost felt like home, if you can believe that. But of course, this home just happened to also be home to 8-foot caimans, riverbed stingrays, piranhas, snakes, spiders, and billions of the most dangerous animal in the world, mosquitoes. The 17-year-old girl grabbed what she could from the crash site, which included a bag of candy, and she set out on the solo journey to safety, whatever that was going to entail. And she promised herself that if she could, she would also try to find her mom. Right away, Juliana's survival instincts kicked in. She knew that the jungle was a dangerous place, but she also knew a lot of its secrets. Her father, having spent so much time in the jungle, well, he taught her a lot of valuable lessons. Like, for instance, follow water downstream because it probably will lead to civilization. So she began to listen for water, and soon enough, she found a creek. And she knew the creek had to eventually feed into a stream, and lo and behold, that's exactly what she found. But there were still no signs of humans or civilization or any sort of safety, and so her only choice was to just follow this stream. The days were absolutely brutal, and I don't use that word lightly. Juliana stumbled through the foliage, battling dehydration, hunger, and the onslaught of all these biting insects. And to give her legs some rest, she would actually jump into the alligator-infested stream and just float waist deep down it, right? She knew that piranhas only attacked in the shallow, and so she stayed calm, even as the bloodthirsty fish swam by her legs. I mean, to me, that's crazy, but she was confident enough in herself that she just knew that this was what had to be done. Now, Juliana was facing a number of issues, but two of the biggest ones were, it was the wet season, which meant that her food options were extremely scarce. Not only did this make her trek super sloshy and just overall uncomfortable, but her ripped clothing started to fall apart, and this exposed her to the elements. During the night, it would absolutely dump rain, and this would sting her skin even worse than a lot of the mosquitoes did. Now, the second thing, so remember that gash on her arm I mentioned a few minutes ago when the plane crashed? Fair warning, well, that gash got a lot worse. Like, this is disgusting. So you've been warned, okay? I guess that because Juliana was spending so much time around swarms of bugs and then dipping into the water, her arm wound became the perfect environment for life to begin. And by life, I mean maggots. That's right. Maggots began to live inside of her open wound. So that was a problem. On her fourth day of hiking, Juliana was basically just in full adrenaline mode, right? Pushing through to get a little bit further each day. But all of a sudden, a sound that she hadn't heard before basically stopped her in her tracks. Vultures. She saw vultures circling above. She instantly knew that the vultures must have found something, and so she followed them to a part of the forest that looked like it had been raised down by something massive. She then walked up to a horrible sight. She found 3 pairs of feet sticking out from the ground, still wrapped inside of their plane seats. Folks, she was not hallucinating. I mean, she quickly realized that the bodies that were attached to these feet had been driven down into the soil and then half buried, right? And she also noticed that one of the bodies was that of a woman. She immediately began to assume the worst. I mean, you know where I'm going with this. Could this possibly be the body of her mother? And so, heart pounding, Juliana took off the woman's shoes in order to examine her nail polish. I mean, she knew exactly what her mother's toes, her nail polish would look like, right? I mean, can you just imagine how she probably felt in this moment? Like, this is the morbid moment of truth, you could say. But thankfully, this was not her mother, which probably brought her some fleeting comfort, but still, I mean, at this point, she must have known that the odds of her mother's survival were extremely low, and there wasn't anything else she could do, right? She had to just keep moving. The days grew longer, and Juliana grew hungrier. She had run out of candy long before this point, and the dirty stream water wasn't really safe enough to drink in large quantities, or probably at all, but what choice did she have? And to make things worse, she could actually hear the search planes above the thick canopy kind of humming around, almost like they were taunting her. She knew that she couldn't really do anything to alert them, right? And even those planes didn't really last, because after day 7, things went quiet. At that point, they had called off the search, and Juliana was truly now all on her own. By day 10, she was really struggling. She was starving, she was getting sick, and her bug-infested arm was just getting worse. I mean, it was in serious trouble now. She was getting desperate for any relief, but by her rough calculations, she felt like she couldn't have been too far from civilization. And just as she was preparing for another night out in the cold rain, she stumbled into a very small sign of hope. She found this tiny little human-made hut with a palm leaf roof. She cracked open the door, hoping to find, maybe a person in there, or at the very least some food, but unfortunately, neither one of those things was inside the hut. But what she did find was a small can of petrol oil and a shelter for the night, which is better than nothing, right? Now, some of you might be thinking that she would have had no use for that oil, right? I mean, maybe she could start a fire, but believe it or not, there was actually something else that she realized she could do with this oil. So Juliana remembered something that she had learned from her dad. When their family dog's wound had become infested with maggots like hers now was. And you might see where I'm going with this, you might not. I'm just gonna say it. She poured the gasoline into her open wound and basically just suffocated as many of the bugs that had taken up residency in there as she possibly could. Can you imagine how much that would sting? So after doing this, she decides it's time to try to fall asleep in the hut. But at this point, her living nightmare, or her nightmares, reached a breaking point, we'll say. She was in pain. Once again, she's starving, and the gasoline that she had poured into that bug-infested wound hadn't quite finished off the job. And of course, all these factors combined, making it pretty much impossible to sleep. The next morning, as she still sat in this hut, she began to hear the sounds of animals. And I should specify, these weren't just little, chipmunks or frogs. These were big animals nearby. And at this point, she's basically ready to give up. And so she was probably just thinking, whatever these animals are, like, they can just have me. Like, I'm done. I don't even care. But as the animal sounds approached and got louder, it actually hit her that these weren't actually animals. Well, I guess technically they were. But no, they were humans. Juliana ran out of the shelter, and there, right in front of her, were 3 Peruvian lumberjacks. Her, albeit unintentional, rescuers. The first living people that she had seen in 11 days. As soon as she saw these men, she knew that her nightmare was finally over. Against all the odds, Juliana had survived a plane crash and 11 days surviving in the jungle all by herself. The men put Juliana in a canoe and then took her down the river to a small missionary where she would eventually be airlifted to a hospital. And as they went down the river, the local villagers couldn't help themselves but just to stare at her, right? Let's just say that Juliana was a pretty strange sight to them. I mean, she was this skinny blonde girl with tattered clothes and dirt all over her. But more than that, her eyes were so bloodshot and swollen that the locals could have sworn that they had seen a forest demon. Later, as she began to recover at the hospital, the only thing on Juliana's mind was her mother. I'm sure by now she realized the chances that her mother had survived were very slim, but nonetheless, she was still holding on to some distant hope that maybe, just maybe, her mother had survived the unsurvivable just like she did. But folks, it was worse than Juliana could have ever imagined. She did finally learn the tragic fate of her mother, and also learned that every single other person aboard Lanza Flight 508 had perished. Juliana was the only survivor of the crash. It is believed that 14 other people survived initially after landing in different parts of the jungle, but we'll never know about what they experienced or how long they lived before eventually giving in to the Amazon's will. Incredibly, just a week or so after she was rescued, Juliana volunteered to go out with the search parties in order to find more bodies. But she did quickly realize just how traumatized she was with survivor's guilt and, of course, with the images that she had come across during the ordeal. I mean, I've said this before, but like, don't forget, this is a 17-year-old girl who had just graduated from high school and was anticipating spending Christmas with her parents doing what they all loved. And so Juliana returned to Germany to figure things out and to try to put together a normal life after going through this just insane experience. Now, to be the sole survivor of anything creates a lot of pressure for what to do with the rest of your life. And I mention that because I think it's just worth celebrating the fact that, by all accounts, Juliana went on to become an amazing woman. She studied biology and went on to be one of the world's leading experts on bats. Then later in life, she became the director of the Panguana Research Station, taking over the role from her dad. And in 2011, she wrote an award-winning book about her life. She's now around 70 years old and seemingly still doing great. Now, there is one last thing I want to tell you about Juliana's story. And this is actually pretty cool because I'm someone who's maybe like a little morbidly fascinated in the concept of like visiting the sites where these kinds of stories happen, right? So in 1998, a documentary came out directed by Werner Herzog called Wings of Hope. Now, Werner was actually supposed to be on the very same flight that Juliana took, but he had some last minute change in plans. And thank God he did, because he would go on to direct some awesome movies. But this one is really special because the director decided to follow Juliana back to Peru and retrace her steps of survival. And so, folks, this is all on film. And I've even got some stills to show you from it right here. In this one, Juliana is sitting next to the row of airplane chairs that she landed with at the first crash site. And here, Juliana is standing, kind of just chilling in the middle of the stream with piranhas all around her. And this last one is particularly amazing. This is actually her meeting one of the lumberjacks who found her on the final day of her trek. I'd highly recommend watching the documentary. It adds some cool details to what I told you about in this video. And folks, let me know in the comments if there are other stories like Juliana's out there, because to me, I don't know, it's different than a lot of the stories on this channel, and it's one of the most epic life or death stories I've ever come across. I mean, from 10,000 feet in the sky to 11 days of survival in the Amazon, it's just incredible. The Appalachian Mountains have a dark, dark secret. Beneath their serene beauty and endless wilderness lies a mystery that has haunted park rangers, hikers, and even the FBI for over half a century. In the summer of 1969, a young boy vanished just a few feet away from his family. A promising search was launched, but this quickly descended into absolute chaos, the details of which are so insane that you're probably gonna think that I'm lying to you. Of course, I'm not lying, but that doesn't mean that others haven't lied about this case. Let me tell you the story of what is probably the most dramatic disappearance in all of national park history. And by the time that you hear the end of this story, I'm gonna share something that a lot of you might not want to hear. Something that frankly might piss you off. So almost 2 years ago, I made a video covering the disappearance of Dennis Martin, and everything was fine with that video until a few weeks ago when I was suddenly forced to delete it due to some frustrating bureaucratic stuff related to YouTube. I won't go into that, but it was actually kind of a mixed blessing, because when I went back and watched my original video, I realized that I actually left out a very, very important point that I now have a fresh chance to make. And so to start off our story, let's head together to the most visited national park in all of the United States, which is Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So on Father's Day weekend in the year 1969, the Martin family left their home in Knoxville, Tennessee, and headed straight to the Smoky Mountains. The group consisted of 6-year-old Dennis, 9-year-old Douglas, their father Bill, and their grandfather Clyde. This trip to Great Smoky Mountains National Park was actually a family tradition, but Dennis, because he was so young, he had never gone before until now. This was going to be his very first time ever going camping. Dennis was about 4 feet tall, and he weighed about 55 pounds. Now, he had been on like a few day hikes before, and he reportedly walked so fast that the adults couldn't always keep up with him, but he had never gone camping. But of course, that didn't mean that he wasn't comfortable and happy in the woods, which by everything that people have said, he certainly was. He must have been very excited. The Martin family started their adventure from Cades Cove Campground on Friday, and from there, they hiked up to the Appalachian Trail, which kind of runs along the dividing ridge between the North Carolina and Tennessee state borders. On this particular day, it was perfect hiking weather, beautiful, sunny, and I'm sure that the group was just thrilled to get to their first campsite, which was the Russell Field Shelter. They spent the night there, and then the next day, they decided to take it kind of easy, only hiking a few miles north on the Appalachian Trail to their next campsite, which was Spence Field. They made their way down the trail, they reached Spence Field, and then, of course, they set up their camp. And something that's kind of interesting is that nearly 50 years later, I actually did the exact same thing in the exact same spot when I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail. Though I will say, at the time, I had no idea about how infamous of a place Spence Field is. I might have rethought my decision had I known about the next series of events you're going to hear about in this story. At Spence Field, the Martins were joined by some family friends, and sometime in the afternoon, the group kind of just sat down to relax. I mean, camp was set up, lunch had been consumed, and all the dishes had been done. So there really wasn't much else for the adults to do besides kind of just sit there and take in the scenery. However, for the young boys, they're not just gonna sit there and be still. It was playtime now, and the grassy knoll that they were camped on was pretty much the perfect spot for it. Dennis, Douglas, and 2 other boys that were with them hatched a devious plan to kind of sneak up on all the adults and surprise them. A prank, if you will. However, unbeknownst to the boys, the adults were onto them, They kind of just watched and laughed as the group of boys split up in different directions. Douglas and those two other boys went to the south, and Dennis, who was by himself, went to the north and west, kind of towards the Tennessee side of the ridge. Again, they're camped like right on the border of the two states. All the adults pretended to be surprised when the boys kind of jumped out at them, and rounds of laughter quickly followed. However, within no more than, say, 5 minutes, nobody was laughing, because it's by this point that everyone realized Dennis hadn't jumped out with the rest of the boys. He wasn't even around anymore. He was nowhere to be found. Dennis had basically vanished into thin air. So Dennis was wearing a red t-shirt on this camping trip, and it's because of this, because red kind of sticks out, especially in nature. It's because of this that all of the boys planned for him to sneak around kind of on his own, away from them, so that he wouldn't, just give them all away to the adults they were trying to surprise. But clearly that backfired, because nobody saw him disappear. And so when everyone realized that Dennis was gone, Bill and Clyde started kind of just calling out his name, but they heard nothing and saw nothing, for that matter, in return. Getting more and more desperate, they decided to just spring into action and began looking along the trails. Bill Martin in particular traveled south on the Appalachian Trail for about a mile before returning to Spence Field, hoping that his son would be back by then. But when he realized that Dennis was still lost, Bill turned around and he headed south again, this time hiking the 2.5 miles all the way back to Russell Field, where they had camped the first night. But of course, once again, Bill ended up turning around, heading back to Spence Field without his son, and without any sign of his son either. While Bill was desperately searching along the Appalachian Trail, Clyde made his way completely off of the ridge. He hiked over 8 miles down back to Cades Cove Campground, where he reached a ranger station. Of course, this served one very important purpose, which was to report Dennis Martin missing, which is what he did at roughly 8:30 p.m. that night, which just so happened to be the day before the boy's 7th birthday. This marked the start of a search effort, which would turn more and more into a, pardon my language here, I'm just gonna say it, a show with each passing day. You're gonna understand why I say that very shortly, but I'm getting ahead of myself. On this first night, the search was still quite limited, to be honest. In addition to all the searching that Bill and Clyde had done, Rangers interviewed hikers at Spence Field who had, traveled in from various directions and various trails and stuff like that. However, none of them had noticed anything out of the ordinary, let alone actually seen Dennis himself. And then, that very first night, a massive storm rolled through the Smoky Mountains, dumping down almost 3 inches of rain in just the span of a few hours. This was obviously extremely unlucky for the search. The Smokies are known for their volatile weather after all, and they're technically a rainforest, but regardless of how normal this was, the thunderstorms were very, very bad news for the search, because not only did the weather stop everyone in their tracks, right at the most critical point of the search, mind you, but after the storm passed, it left Spence Field and the surrounding area a muddy, flooded mess. This would hinder the pace of searching the next morning, and also potentially cover up important clues and evidence about where Dennis Martin could have ended up. And also, it brings me no pleasure to say this, but let's just be honest here, that weather could have killed the boy. Without any shelter, he could have easily become hypothermic or been swept away in a flash flood, something horrible like that. And searchers knew that this could have been the case. But regardless, they had a job to do. And so the next day, they completely ramped up their efforts, and I don't say that lightly. By the afternoon, there was 240 people in the park searching for Dennis. At this point, his mother had also arrived after learning at church that her son was missing. How terrible is that? And if you thought 240 was a lot, well, wait till you hear this. So from there, the number of searchers started to balloon at a ridiculous rate. Within a week, some 1,400 people, many of whom were volunteers, descended upon the Smoky Mountains, eager to find Dennis. Groups ranging from the Boy Scouts all the way up to the Green Berets showed up. I mean, helicopters were used, dogs were used, even loudspeakers were deployed. President Nixon even contacted park officials telling them that he would be following the search. Now, one might think that there's strength in numbers, and usually there is, but it's at this point that the search really started to just fall apart. A search effort of this magnitude had pretty much never been seen before, and organization was all but impossible. Some volunteers reportedly didn't know how to use a compass or other important searching tools, navigation tools. At one point, a volunteer searcher fell off of a bridge and broke his arm, requiring medical attention. Another searcher accidentally shot himself in the leg, requiring even more intense medical attention. And those Green Berets I mentioned, remember them? Well, they would end up hiking themselves so deep into the woods that they ran out of food and ended up killing and barbecuing a rattlesnake in order to sustain themselves. Retired park ranger Dwight McCarter was involved in the search from the morning after Dennis went missing, so almost from the beginning. And he said this, quote, "All those people, that's a lot of footprints. All those trucks, we searched and searched and searched. Something should have been found. But you have to know what to look for. Get just a few of us trackers in first and give us a chance." Nobody really saw it coming, but the fact that they had so many people searching and so many inexperienced and unorganized groups searching probably actually hindered the search effort rather than doing the opposite. And though this search was certainly a disaster, the obvious reason that so many people wanted to help is because, I mean, it's a 7-year-old boy after all. I mean, that's just terrible, right? It's a case that tugs at people's heartstrings. And so, you know, I'm obviously criticizing the search efforts here. I do also want to just take a moment to acknowledge the heart and the determination that all of the searchers displayed, even if, you know, it ended up hurting things ultimately. Despite so many people on the ground, this massive effort, Dennis Martin was never located. And in addition to that, hardly any evidence at all was found. It basically just seemed like he up and vanished, as if the Smoky Mountains simply just swallowed him whole. However, there was one potential clue discovered on day 4 of the search, and this was a clue that possibly gives us a glimpse into what might have happened to the missing boy. In the vicinity of Eagle Creek, which was roughly a mile away from where Dennis Martin was last seen, some hikers discovered suspicious-looking footprints leading off of a trail. They ended up following these footprints as far as they could, which was some 300 yards, we'll say, before finally kind of losing them at the edge of one of the many flooded streams in the area. But it's important to know that these weren't just any footprints that could have belonged to anyone. A close examination of the footprints provided evidence that they might have belonged to Dennis. First of all, one of the prints was from a barefoot, and then the other print was from a shoe. And of course, that would be consistent with a lost, desperate boy kind of roaming around the woods. And second of all, these prints were found at kind of a confusing junction, one with a water break there, and it kind of looked like a trail. And, you know, it easily could have confused a child, and then, you know, he could have followed it and then found himself completely lost in the wilderness off trail. And the kicker when it comes to these footprints was that they were small. You could even describe them as child-sized. Searchers were very intrigued by this evidence, and so they made a cast of the prints. However, the Martin family felt as though these prints were too big for Dennis's feet. And after this, it didn't take long for an explanation to emerge, which was that the tracks were left by Boy Scouts, which kind of explains the small feet And remember, the Boy Scouts were involved in the search efforts. And besides that, those Green Berets I told you about earlier would end up confirming that they had already searched the area where the prints were found. And they even insisted that they would have found Dennis if he was nearby. But then again, considering how much of a mess this search was, I find it hard to look back and completely discount the evidence that is these footprints. First of all, the prints were that of one single child, not an entire troop of Boy Scouts, right? And so that explanation doesn't really make sense to me. And also, there's no way that the Boy Scouts would have been searching without their shoes on through this difficult terrain. Like, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense, right? Like something's off about this. But regardless of my feelings on it, you know, this clue, the only potential clue that resulted from this massive search, well, it was never properly followed up on. And so I can speculate all day about it, but we're just never really going to know how much validity it had. Now, you might be surprised to know that there were actually a few more clues into the disappearance of Dennis Martin, but all of these clues came in after the official search had already been suspended. So more than a month after the disappearance, a man came forward and claimed that while visiting Cades Cove on Father's Day weekend, he actually witnessed something kind of suspicious. The man claimed that he was hiking off trail, kind of just bushwhacking, and he was quoted saying, "When we got about half a mile or maybe 3/4 of a mile from the car, we heard a scream, a troubled scream, an enormous, sickening scream. We couldn't tell which direction it came from, but it sounded like it came from higher on the mountain to me. I looked across the creek and saw a man in the bushes. I couldn't tell much about him because he was going down the creek towards the cars. He was definitely trying to keep from being seen. I thought maybe he was a moonshiner." After seeing this man, the witness then allegedly discovered a homemade map where this mysterious man had been standing previously, and the witness also noticed that the man had likely driven off in a older model white Chevrolet. Now, this story sounds promising, right? But after investigating, officials would end up concluding that it was completely unrelated to Dennis Martin's disappearance. They actually believed that the man's location at the time was just too far away from Spence Field for Dennis to have possibly traveled there in the timeline that was presented. And thus, the second lead in the case hit a dead end, and it would unfortunately be years before the next lead would present itself. 16 years to be exact. In 1985, a man came forward and reported that he had discovered the remains of a small child in the area of Big Hollow, which is near Tremont, Tennessee, deep inside the national park. This discovery was supposedly made some 3 to 4 miles straight line from where Dennis Martin was last seen. When this was reported, the area was searched by up to 30 people, but once again, nothing was found. The man who made this report actually said that he had found the body like years earlier, but he didn't tell anyone at the time because he was out illegally hunting ginseng. You know, he didn't want to blow his cover there. And so by the time they actually went to search, they didn't find anything. And so this lead would also end up being a dead end. So with that said, what the hell could have happened to Dennis Martin? I mean, that's the big question here. And there's been a range of theories discussed over the years. I mean, it's possible that Dennis was the unfortunate victim of one of the thousands of black bears in the Smoky Mountains. Or, of course, maybe he was bitten by a rattlesnake, a copperhead, or a cottonmouth. And then, of course, there are some more dramatic theories, we'll say. Like, is it possible that there's a supernatural or even mythical explanation for his disappearance? Now, from my observation, there's been an outsized amount of discussion about, like, Bigfoot somehow being involved with Dennis's disappearance. And don't get me wrong, you know, that's something that always gets brought up by at least somebody whenever there's a disappearance in the woods. But it seems to really have caught on for this particular story. I mean, I see people talking about it all the time. Of course, it kind of depends on where you look, but this Sasquatch theory is, you know, often presented as a possible explanation for Dennis's disappearance. And look, I'm not here to like call out anyone specifically. I don't even really have anyone specifically in mind while I'm saying this. And I'm also not gonna pretend that I know what happened to Dennis Martin. I most certainly don't. I mean, there's definitely something strange, even something mysterious about this story. But at the same time, it seems perfectly plausible to me that Dennis just disappeared, you know, without having to resort to like Bigfoot to explain it. I've covered a lot of stories about people who went missing while they were hiking or in the woods on this channel. And in a lot of those stories, they're pretty baffling. Like there's really just no explanation. Like what the hell happened, you know? But in this particular story, I really do feel like it's realistic that Dennis probably wandered away from the campsite. You know, he was trying to hide or whatever. And then he probably got lost in the thick woods and then traveled in the wrong direction. The storms came in, the weather got bad, and that combined with the absolute mess of a search resulted in him never being found. And so despite all of the lore that surrounds this case, the mystery, in my humble opinion, that is almost certainly what happened. And it is kind of interesting to me how this story in particular has been so like heavily associated with Bigfoot. Apparently there were like some sightings of Bigfoot around the time. I don't know. And I could be wrong too. And the truth is that nobody knows for sure what happened, because despite the biggest search in Great Smoky Mountain National Park's history, Dennis Martin's fate remains the Appalachian Trail's darkest secret to this day. I mean, the search cost over $70,000, which is over $500,000 in today's money, and yet we still don't know. Bill Martin, Dennis's father, died in 2014 without getting any closure on his son's disappearance, and Spence Field, where all of this started, has since been taken over by tree growth. That's how I remember it. Hardly resembling a field anymore at all. My heart goes out to Dennis Martin, of course, Bill Martin, and the rest of the Martin family. And though this case is sad, there is a silver lining here. This tragedy directly resulted in improved search procedures, not just throughout the park or throughout the United States, but literally throughout the world. It's basically been a case study in what not to do in terms of search and rescue. And therefore, this story has likely saved many, many lives. And so I wanted to leave you with that perspective. Please show some love for Dennis and the rest of his family, Bill and Clyde certainly, in the comments section. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so go give that a click. And guys, thank you for letting me retell this story. I promise I won't make a habit out of it. It just happened to work out this time. And I'll see you in the next video.